The year 865 AD marked a pivotal moment in the relationship between Scandinavia and the British Isles, as economic pressures, political upheaval, and personal vengeance converged to create the most formidable Viking military force ever assembled. The Great Heathen Army emerged not as a spontaneous raiding expedition, but as a calculated response to mounting challenges across the Nordic kingdoms and a deliberate campaign of conquest that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of England. Scandinavia in the mid-9th century faced a confluence of destabilizing forces that made large-scale military expeditions increasingly attractive to ambitious jarls and displaced warriors. The population had grown substantially during the preceding decades, creating pressure on available agricultural land. The traditional practice of partible inheritance meant that younger sons often found themselves with insufficient resources to maintain their status within established hierarchies. Climate data suggests that the medieval warm period was creating both opportunities and challenges. While agricultural yields improved in some regions, coastal flooding and changing weather patterns disrupted traditional settlements and trade routes. The political structure of Denmark, Norway and Sweden remained fragmented, with numerous petty kingdoms competing for dominance. Harald Fairhair's consolidation efforts in Norway displaced many prominent families who refused to submit to his authority. These exiled nobles, along with their retainers and supporters, formed a significant pool of experienced warriors seeking new opportunities for wealth and status. Similarly, internal conflicts in Denmark between various claimants to regional thrones created instability that pushed military leaders to seek fortune abroad, rather than engage in potentially ruinous civil wars. Economic factors played an equally crucial role in motivating the formation of the Great Heathen Army. The silver trade routes connecting Scandinavia with the Islamic world through the Volga river system had become increasingly disrupted by political instability in the Kazakh Khaganate and the expansion of Magyar tribes into the Pontic steppe. This disruption reduced the flow of Arabic silver that had fueled Scandinavian economies for generations, forcing Viking leaders to seek alternative sources of wealth. England, with its established monasteries, trading centres, and agricultural surplus, represented an attractive target for systematic exploitation rather than simple raiding. The catalyst that transformed these underlying pressures into organised military action came through the legendary figure of Ragnar Lothbrok and the circumstances surrounding his death. According to multiple sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later Icelandic sagas, Ragnar had been captured during a raid on Northumbria and executed by King Aella, using the gruesome method of being thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. While the historical existence of Ragnar Lothbrok remains debated among modern scholars, the political reality of his sons and their subsequent actions is well documented in contemporary sources. The leadership structure that emerged around the sons of Ragnar represented a sophisticated coalition of experienced military commanders, each bringing distinct capabilities and regional support networks. Ivar the Boneless emerged as the primary strategic mind behind the Confederation. Contemporary sources describe him as exceptionally intelligent and ruthless, capable of inspiring fierce loyalty among his followers while maintaining diplomatic relationships with potential allies. His epithet, the Boneless, has generated considerable scholarly debate, with interpretations ranging from a physical condition that prevented him from walking normally to a metaphorical reference to his flexibility in negotiations and strategy. Halfdan Ragnarsson commanded substantial respect as a traditional warrior king, leading from the front in battle while maintaining the administrative capabilities necessary to coordinate large-scale military operations. His forces drew heavily from Danish territories, particularly from regions that had experienced displacement due to Harald Bluetooth's earlier consolidation efforts. Halfdan's reputation for personal courage in combat made him particularly effective at recruiting young warriors seeking to prove themselves in battle. Ubba brought extensive naval expertise to the Confederation, having spent years perfecting the art of coastal raiding and amphibious warfare. His knowledge of English coastal defences, tidal patterns and suitable landing sites proved invaluable in planning the invasion. Uber's fleet included some of the largest and most sophisticated longships available, capable of carrying substantial numbers of warriors and their equipment across the North Sea in various weather conditions. Sigurd's snake in the eye contributed political connections and diplomatic skills that helped legitimise the expedition among Scandinavian nobility. His ability to negotiate agreements with various jarls and maintain coalition unity during the extended planning phase proved crucial to the army's eventual success. Sigurd also brought substantial financial resources, accumulated through successful trading ventures and previous raiding expeditions. The recruitment process for the great heathen army followed established patterns of Scandinavian military organisation, while scaling up to unprecedented levels. The core leadership relied on their personal retinues, professional warriors bound by oaths of loyalty and expectations of generous reward. These Huskarls formed the backbone of the army, providing experienced leadership for larger groups of seasonal warriors and adventurers. Each major leader maintained a hall where warriors could find hospitality, equipment, and opportunities for advancement through successful military service. Beyond these professional warriors, the army attracted substantial numbers of farmers, craftsmen, and younger sons seeking opportunities unavailable in their home regions. The recruitment process emphasized practical skills rather than noble birth. Blacksmiths, carpenters, sailors, and others with useful trades found places within the expedition. This diverse composition gave the army remarkable logistical capabilities, allowing them to maintain and repair equipment, construct fortifications, and establish semi-permanent bases during extended campaigns. The geographical distribution of recruits reflected the political connections and reputation of the Ragnarsson brothers across Scandinavia. Danish contingents formed the largest single component, drawn from Jutland, Zealand, and the Danish islands. These warriors brought experience from conflicts with the Frankish Empire and familiarity with siege warfare techniques learned during campaigns against fortified Carolingian positions. Norwegian participants included many displaced nobles and their followers, seeking to rebuild their fortunes after losing conflicts with Harald Fairhair's expanding kingdom. Swedish involvement proved more complex, as the various kingdoms of Götaland and Svealand maintained different relationships with the Ragnarsson leadership. Some Swedish jarls contributed ships and warriors in exchange for shares of expected plunder, while others provided logistical support and safe passage through their territories. The Swedish contingents brought particular expertise in riverine warfare and inland navigation, skills that would prove valuable during later campaigns in England. The military preparations for the invasion required unprecedented coordination and resource management. The assembly of a fleet capable of transporting thousands of warriors, along with their weapons, supplies, and equipment, demanded careful planning and substantial financial investment. Contemporary sources suggest the fleet included between 200 and 300 vessels of various sizes, from large dragon ships capable of carrying 80 warriors to smaller coastal vessels used for reconnaissance and supply transport. The logistical challenges of maintaining such a force during the crossing and initial landing phases required innovative solutions. The army developed a sophisticated supply chain that included advance parties establishing supply depots along the English coast, coordination with existing Scandinavian trading networks, and agreements with local populations willing to provide food and materials in exchange for protection or payment. Weapons procurement and standardization represented another crucial aspect of the military preparations. While individual warriors typically provided their own basic equipment, the leadership ensured access to high-quality iron weapons, particularly spears and axes that could be produced efficiently in large quantities. The army's weaponsmiths developed standardized designs that balanced effectiveness with ease of manufacture and repair. Archaeological evidence from contemporary sites suggests the great heathen army employed more uniform equipment than typical Viking raiding parties, indicating centralized planning and resource allocation. The strategic planning phase revealed the sophisticated military thinking that distinguished the great heathen army from previous Viking expeditions. Rather than focusing on quick raids and immediate return to Scandinavia, the leadership developed a comprehensive campaign strategy aimed at territorial conquest and long-term occupation. Intelligence gathering played a crucial role in this planning, with advanced scouts providing detailed information about English political divisions, military capabilities, and economic resources. The timing of the invasion reflected careful consideration of English political circumstances. The death of Ethelbert of Wessex in 865 AD created uncertainty about West Saxon leadership, while ongoing conflicts between the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms provided opportunities for the Vikings to exploit divisions among their enemies. The army's leadership demonstrated sophisticated understanding of English politics, recognizing that successful conquest required not just military victory, but also the ability to establish lasting control over conquered territories. The final preparations in 865 AD included religious and cultural elements that reinforced the army's cohesion and sense of purpose. While specific details of pre-invasion rituals remain unclear from contemporary sources, later accounts suggest the leadership conducted ceremonies invoking the favour of Odin and other war gods. These rituals served practical purposes beyond their spiritual significance, creating shared experiences that bound together warriors from different regions and backgrounds, while reinforcing the authority of the Ragnarsson brothers as legitimate war leaders. The great heathen army's crossing of the North Sea occurred during the autumn months of 865 AD, taking advantage of seasonal wind patterns that favoured eastward travel from Danish and Norwegian ports. The fleet approached the English coast in multiple waves, with advanced reconnaissance vessels identifying suitable landing sites along the East Anglian shoreline several days before the main force arrived. Contemporary sources, including entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, indicate the Vikings made landfall near modern-day Great Yarmouth, though archaeological evidence suggests multiple landing points were utilised to distribute the logistical burden and reduce the risk of concentrated Anglo-Saxon resistance. The initial beaching operations demonstrated the sophisticated naval capabilities that distinguished this expedition from earlier Viking raids. The larger dragon ships, drawing too much water to approach the shore directly, anchored in deeper water while smaller vessels ferried warriors, equipment and supplies to the beach. The army's engineers had prepared portable wooden platforms that could be quickly assembled to create temporary docks, allowing for rapid unloading of heavy items including dismantled siege equipment, iron ingots for weapon repair, and substantial quantities of preserved food supplies. The selection of East Anglia as the primary landing zone reflected careful strategic analysis by the Viking leadership. The kingdom occupied a geographically advantageous position, jutting into the North Sea with extensive coastline that provided multiple escape routes if retreat became necessary. The region's relatively flat terrain favoured the mobile warfare tactics that formed the foundation of Viking military doctrine, while numerous rivers provided inland transportation routes for the shallow draft vessels that accompanied the main fleet. East Anglia's political situation in 865 AD made it particularly vulnerable to foreign invasion. King Edmund, who had ruled since around 855 AD, commanded a kingdom that lacked the military resources and fortification systems of larger Anglo-Saxon realms like Wessex or Mercia. The East Anglian army consisted primarily of the king's personal retinue and levies drawn from local thanes, totalling perhaps 2,000–3,000 warriors at full mobilisation. This force proved woefully inadequate to contest a landing by the great heathen army, which contemporary estimates suggest numbered between 5,000 and 8,000 combat-effective warriors. The economic attractions of East Anglia proved equally compelling to the Viking planners. The region's agricultural productivity, enhanced by extensive fenland drainage projects completed during the 8th century, generated substantial grain surpluses that could feed a large army throughout the winter months. The kingdom's position as a trading hub connecting continental Europe with the rest of England meant that substantial quantities of silver, manufactured goods, and other valuable materials moved through East Anglian markets. The region's horse breeding industry, centred around the chalk downs of western Norfolk and northern Suffolk, provided the Vikings with an opportunity to acquire the mounts necessary for rapid inland campaigns. Upon establishing their beachhead, the great heathen army moved with characteristic speed to secure their position and begin extracting resources from the surrounding countryside. The Vikings constructed a fortified camp using a combination of earthworks and wooden palisades, following defensive principles developed during previous campaigns against Frankish forces. This base, likely located near modern-day Thetford, based on archaeological evidence and place-name analysis, served as the army's primary winter quarters and operational headquarters for the duration of their stay in East Anglia. The Viking military organisation that emerged during the East Anglian campaign revealed the sophisticated command structure that enabled such a large force to operate effectively over extended periods. The army maintained its basic division along the lines of the original recruitment networks, with Danish, Norwegian and Swedish contingents retaining distinct identities while operating under unified strategic direction. Each major contingent maintained its own supply trains, weapon maintenance facilities, and internal disciplinary systems, reducing the administrative burden on the central leadership while preserving the cultural bonds that motivated individual warriors. The tactical innovations displayed by the great heathen army during their East Anglian operations demonstrated significant evolution from traditional Viking raiding methods. Rather than relying solely on surprise attacks and rapid withdrawal, the army developed techniques for sustained territorial control that incorporated elements of siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and coordinated infantry movements. The Vikings' acquisition of horses from East Anglian breeding centres proved particularly significant, as mounted warriors could cover vastly greater distances than infantry forces, enabling rapid strikes against multiple targets while maintaining central coordination. Viking weaponry during this period reflected both traditional Scandinavian designs and innovations developed specifically for large-scale warfare. The typical warrior carried a round shield approximately 3 feet in diameter, constructed from limewood planks bound with iron and covered with leather. Spears remained the primary weapon for most fighters, with ashwood shafts ranging from 6 to 10 feet in length, topped by iron points designed for both thrusting and throwing. The famous Viking axes varied considerably in size and design, from small hand axes suitable for close combat to massive two-handed weapons capable of cleaving through mail armour and shields. Swords, while prestigious and effective, remained relatively uncommon due to the substantial iron requirements and skilled craftsmanship necessary for their production. Archaeological evidence from contemporary sites suggests that perhaps 1 warrior in 10 carried a sword, typically indicating higher status within the military hierarchy. The Vikings employed pattern-welded construction techniques that created blades of exceptional strength and flexibility, though the time and materials required meant that most warriors relied on spears and axes as their primary weapons. The army's organisational structure incorporated sophisticated logistics systems that enabled sustained operations far from their Scandinavian bases. Specialised craftsmen accompanied the fighting force, including blacksmiths capable of repairing weapons and manufacturing new equipment, carpenters who could construct siege engines and fortifications, and shipwrights who maintained the fleet and built new vessels as needed. The Vikings established supply chains that connected their East Anglian base with trading networks extending across the North Sea, ensuring access to iron, silver, and other strategic materials. The Anglo-Saxon response to the Viking landing revealed both the strengths and limitations of 9th century English military organisation. King Edmund of East Anglia initially attempted to contain the threat through diplomatic means, possibly offering tribute payments in exchange for Viking withdrawal. Contemporary sources suggest negotiations occurred during the winter of 865–866 AD, though the specific terms and participants remain unclear from surviving records. The diplomatic approach reflected practical recognition that East Anglia lacked the military capacity to expel such a large invasion force through direct confrontation. The broader Anglo-Saxon reaction demonstrated the fragmented nature of English political authority during this period. While the various kingdoms maintained formal diplomatic relationships and occasionally cooperated against external threats, no effective mechanism existed for coordinating a unified response to the Viking invasion. King Burgrad of Mercia, whose kingdom bordered East Anglia to the west, focused primarily on defending his own territories rather than providing military assistance to Edmund. Similarly, the West Saxon leadership under King Ethelred, who had succeeded his brother Aethelbert in 865 AD, concentrated on strengthening their own defences rather than organising a coalition response. The Viking strategy during their East Anglian sojourn focused on systematic resource extraction, while preparing for expanded operations against larger Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The army established tributary relationships with local populations, demanding regular payments of food, silver, and other supplies in exchange for protection from Viking raids. This system, known as Danegeld in later periods, provided sustainable funding for military operations while avoiding the administrative complexities of direct territorial governance. The psychological impact of the Viking presence extended far beyond the boundaries of East Anglia itself. Reports of the army's size, discipline, and military effectiveness spread throughout Anglo-Saxon England, creating widespread fear and uncertainty about future Viking intentions. Monasteries began hiding their treasures and relocating valuable manuscripts to more secure locations, while local populations in vulnerable areas started constructing defensive works or preparing for potential evacuation. The great heathen army's intelligence-gathering operations during their East Anglian stay provided crucial information for subsequent campaigns. Viking scouts ranged throughout eastern England, mapping road networks, identifying river crossings, and assessing the defensive capabilities of potential targets. The army's leadership cultivated relationships with local informants, including disaffected Anglo-Saxon nobles, merchants seeking trading opportunities, and religious figures willing to cooperate in exchange for protection of their communities. The winter months of 865–866 AD witnessed intensive military preparations as the Viking leadership planned their next phase of operations. The army's weaponsmiths worked continuously to repair damaged equipment and manufacture additional arms for newly recruited warriors. Archaeological evidence suggests the Vikings established semi-permanent workshops capable of producing high-quality iron weapons in substantial quantities, indicating their intention to maintain military operations for extended periods. The acquisition and training of horses represented another crucial aspect of the army's East Anglian preparations. Viking warriors, traditionally infantry fighters, required time and practice to develop effective cavalry tactics. The army's leadership organised training programs that taught Scandinavian warriors to fight effectively from horseback, while also developing new tactical formations that combined mounted and dismounted elements. These innovations would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns against Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, whose military doctrines remained focused on traditional infantry warfare. The diplomatic manoeuvring between the Vikings and various Anglo-Saxon authorities during this period revealed the complex political calculations involved in 9th century warfare. While King Edmund of East Anglia ultimately agreed to provide tribute and supplies to the Viking army, he simultaneously maintained communications with other Anglo-Saxon rulers in hopes of organising eventual resistance. The Vikings, aware of these diplomatic efforts, used their intelligence networks to monitor Anglo-Saxon preparations while continuing to extract maximum resources from their East Anglian base. The great heathen army's transformation from a seaborne raiding force into a land-based military organisation capable of sustained territorial campaigns occurred primarily during their East Anglian sojourn. The army developed new logistical systems, tactical doctrines, and organisational structures that would enable them to challenge the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By the spring of 866 AD, the Vikings had established themselves as a permanent presence in English affairs, setting the stage for the systematic conquest campaigns that would follow their departure from East Anglia. The departure from East Anglia in late 866 AD marked the beginning of the great heathen army's most ambitious phase of conquest. Having spent nearly a year consolidating their resources, training cavalry units, and gathering intelligence about Anglo-Saxon defences, the Vikings now possessed the military capability and strategic knowledge necessary to challenge the most powerful kingdoms of northern England. The decision to march against Northumbria reflected careful analysis of political opportunities, as reports from Viking scouts indicated that the kingdom faced severe internal divisions that could be exploited by a well-coordinated external assault. The northward march proceeded along the ancient Roman road system, with the main Viking force following Ermine Street through the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. The army's transformation during their East Anglian sojourn became immediately apparent in their movement patterns and tactical organisation. Unlike traditional Viking raiding parties that relied primarily on riverine transport, the great heathen army now operated as a combined arms force capable of rapid overland movement. Mounted scouts ranged far ahead of the main column, identifying potential threats and suitable camping sites, while the bulk of the army moved in organised formations that could deploy quickly for battle if confronted by Anglo-Saxon forces. The logistical sophistication of this march demonstrated the organisational evolution that had occurred since the initial landing. Supply wagons, pulled by oxen acquired in East Anglia, carried essential equipment including portable forges, siege materials, and substantial quantities of iron weapons. The Vikings had established a comprehensive support system that included camp followers, craftsmen, and merchants who provided services ranging from weapon repair to food preparation. This expanded military community numbered perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 individuals, making it one of the largest organised forces operating in 9th century Europe. The approach to Northumbrian territory revealed the kingdom's fundamental military weakness compared to the advancing Viking army. Northumbria, in 866 AD, remained the largest Anglo-Saxon kingdom by territorial extent, stretching from the Humber River northward to the Scottish borders and encompassing much of modern Yorkshire, Durham, and Northumberland. However, this geographical advantage masked severe political instability that had plagued the kingdom for decades. The royal succession had been contested repeatedly since the death of King Eanred in 854 AD, with various claimants drawing support from different regional power bases and external allies. The civil war that would prove so advantageous to Viking conquest had erupted in 862 AD when Osbert, who had ruled Northumbria since 849 AD, faced a challenge from Aella, a nobleman whose exact genealogical claims remain unclear from surviving sources. Contemporary chronicles suggest that Aella represented a faction of Northumbrian nobles who opposed Osbert's policies regarding taxation, military service, and relationships with neighbouring kingdoms. The conflict had escalated into open warfare by 866 AD, with both claimants maintaining separate courts and military forces while seeking external support for their respective causes. Osbert's power base centred on the traditional Northumbrian heartland around Bamborough and extended southward through the river valleys of the Tyne and Wear. His supporters included many established noble families whose landholdings had been granted by previous kings, along with ecclesiastical authorities who valued political stability over dynastic legitimacy. Osbert's forces consisted primarily of his personal retinue and levies drawn from loyal thanes, totalling perhaps 3,000 warriors when fully mobilised. His military strategy relied on defensive positions within fortified settlements and the expectation that popular support would eventually force Ella to abandon his challenge. Aella's faction drew strength from newer noble families and regional leaders who had been excluded from Osbert's inner circle. His support extended through the southern portions of Northumbria, particularly around York and the fertile agricultural regions of the Vale of York. Aella's military forces included substantial numbers of younger warriors attracted by promises of land grants and elevated status following victory. His army may have numbered 2,500 to 3,000 men, though the exact figures remain disputed among contemporary sources. Aella's strategy focused on capturing key strongholds and demonstrating his ability to provide effective leadership against external threats. The Viking intelligence network, developed during their East Anglian sojourn, provided detailed information about this civil war and its potential exploitation. Scandinavian traders and raiders had maintained contacts within Northumbria for decades, creating relationships that now proved invaluable for military planning. The Vikings understood that neither Osbert nor Aella commanded sufficient resources to resist a determined invasion while simultaneously fighting each other. More importantly, the civil war had disrupted the kingdom's defensive preparations and prevented the coordination necessary for effective resistance against external threats. The great heathen army's advance into Northumbrian territory proceeded with minimal resistance as local populations, exhausted by years of civil conflict, offered little opposition to the Viking forces. The army's mounted scouts reported that neither Osbert nor Aella had positioned significant forces to contest the Viking approach, apparently believing that their mutual conflict took precedence over the external threat. This strategic miscalculation would prove fatal to both claimants and decisive for Viking conquest of the kingdom. York, known to the Anglo-Saxons as Eoforwic, represented the most valuable strategic prize in Northumbria and the obvious target for Viking conquest. The city occupied a commanding position at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, controlling river traffic throughout the region and serving as the administrative centre for the southern portions of the kingdom. York's importance extended beyond its military and political significance, as the city functioned as a major trading hub, connecting Northumbria with continental Europe and serving as the seat of an archbishop whose influence extended throughout northern England. The physical defences of York in 866 AD reflected both Roman engineering and Anglo-Saxon modifications developed over several centuries. The city retained substantial portions of its Roman walls, constructed from local limestone and standing approximately 15 feet high with regular interval towers. The Anglo-Saxons had repaired and extended these fortifications, adding wooden palisades and earthwork barriers to protect areas of expansion beyond the original Roman perimeter. The defensive system included 4 main gates, each protected by barbican structures and capable of withstanding prolonged siege operations. The Viking approach to York demonstrated sophisticated siege warfare techniques that had been developed during campaigns against Frankish fortifications. The army established multiple camps surrounding the city, cutting off supply routes and preventing communication between the defenders and potential relief forces. Viking engineers began construction of siege equipment, including battering rams, scaling ladders, and catapults capable of launching stones and incendiary materials over the city walls. The preparation phase extended over several weeks, during which the Vikings systematically eliminated outlying defensive positions and tightened their control over the surrounding countryside. The defenders of York faced an impossible strategic situation, as the Viking siege intensified during the autumn of 866 AD. The city's garrison consisted primarily of Aela's supporters, as he had gained control of York during the earlier phases of the Civil War. However, the garrison numbered fewer than 1,000 effective warriors, insufficient to man the entire defensive perimeter against a force of 6,000 to 8,000 Viking attackers. The civilian population, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside, strained the city's food supplies and created additional pressure on the defenders. The siege operations revealed the tactical innovations that distinguished the great heathen army from previous Viking expeditions. Rather than relying on direct assault tactics, the Vikings employed systematic approaches designed to minimize their own casualties while maximizing pressure on the defenders. The army's engineers diverted water sources that supplied the city, forcing the defenders to rely on internal wells and stored supplies. Simultaneously, Viking archers and slingers maintained constant harassment of defenders attempting to man the walls, while work parties constructed approach trenches that would enable assault forces to reach the walls under cover. The psychological warfare employed by the Vikings proved equally effective as their physical siege techniques. The army's leaders arranged for captured Northumbrian nobles to be executed within sight of the city walls, demonstrating the fate awaiting those who continue to resist. Viking war cries and weapon displays created constant noise and visual intimidation, while the systematic burning of nearby settlements sent clear messages about the consequences of defiance. These tactics, combined with the obvious hopelessness of the military situation, gradually eroded defender morale and civilian support for continued resistance. The breakthrough came in November 866 AD when Viking assault forces successfully breached the city's eastern wall through a combination of undermining and direct assault. The attack began before dawn, with Viking archers providing covering fire, while assault teams advanced under the protection of portable shields and wooden mantlets. The defenders, weakened by months of siege conditions and constant harassment, could not maintain effective resistance along the entire defensive perimeter. Once the Vikings established a foothold within the walls, the organised defence collapsed rapidly as panic spread throughout the city. The capture of York proceeded with characteristic Viking efficiency and brutality. The army's leadership had planned the assault to minimise damage to valuable infrastructure while eliminating organised resistance. Viking forces moved systematically through the city, securing key buildings, including the royal palace, the cathedral, and the main market areas. Resistance from individual defenders was crushed quickly, though the Vikings showed pragmatic restraint in their treatment of craftsmen, merchants, and other civilians whose skills would prove valuable for future administration of the conquered territory. The wealth discovered within York exceeded even optimistic Viking expectations and validated their strategic decision to target Northumbria's primary city. The royal treasury contained substantial quantities of silver, accumulated through taxation and tribute payments from throughout the kingdom. The cathedral and associated religious buildings yielded additional treasures including decorated manuscripts, precious metalwork, and religious artifacts that could be melted down or traded for strategic materials. The city's merchant community possessed stocks of high-value goods, including silk, spices, and manufactured items from continental Europe. The news of York's fall prompted desperate attempts by both Osbert and Aella to organise relief expeditions, though their efforts remained hampered by mutual distrust and limited military resources. Contemporary sources suggest that initial attempts at cooperation occurred during the winter of 866-867 AD, with both claimants recognising that Viking control of York threatened their respective positions regardless of the civil war's outcome. However, negotiations between the rival factions proved difficult, as each leader demanded recognition of his legitimate authority as the price for military cooperation. The Viking transformation of York into the stronghold of Jorvik began immediately following the city's capture. The army's leadership recognised that effective control of Northumbria required more than military occupation, they needed to establish administrative systems capable of extracting resources while maintaining order among the conquered population. The Vikings appointed local officials who could communicate effectively with Anglo-Saxon subjects while remaining loyal to their new Scandinavian overlords. This pragmatic approach reflected lessons learned from earlier Viking settlements in Ireland and the Frankish territories. The establishment of Jorvik as a major Norse settlement required substantial modifications to the city's existing infrastructure. Viking craftsmen began construction of new defensive works designed to protect against potential Anglo-Saxon counterattacks while accommodating the army's specific tactical requirements. The modifications included strengthened gates, additional watchtowers, and improved communication systems that could coordinate defensive responses across the entire urban area. Simultaneously, the Vikings established workshops for weapon production, ship repair, and other military necessities that would support extended occupation of the conquered territory. The administrative structure implemented in Jorvik demonstrated the sophisticated governmental concepts that the Viking leadership had developed during their campaigns. Rather than imposing purely Scandinavian systems, the conquerors adapted existing Anglo-Saxon administrative practices to serve their own purposes. Local taxation systems continued to operate under Viking supervision, while traditional legal procedures remained in effect for disputes involving Anglo-Saxon subjects. This hybrid approach minimized disruption to daily life, while ensuring that the benefits of conquest flowed to the Viking leadership. The economic transformation of York under Viking rule began during the winter months of 866. 867 AD as Scandinavian merchants and craftsmen established permanent operations within the conquered city. The Vikings recognized that long-term success required more than military control. They needed to create sustainable economic relationships that would generate ongoing revenue while supporting their military objectives. The establishment of trading connections with Scandinavia brought new commercial opportunities while providing access to strategic materials, including iron, timber, and specialized manufactured goods. The spring of 867 AD witnessed the long-delayed attempt by Osbert and Aella to recapture York through coordinated military action. The two rival claimants had finally negotiated a temporary alliance that subordinated their dynastic dispute to the immediate necessity of expelling the Viking invaders. Their combined forces numbered approximately 5,000 warriors, representing the largest Anglo-Saxon army assembled in Northumbria for several decades. The alliance army included both claimants' personal retinues, levies from loyal thanes throughout the kingdom, and volunteers motivated by religious fervour against the heathen invaders. The Anglo-Saxon assault on Jorvik revealed both the strengths and limitations of 9th century English military capabilities. The combined army approached the city with confidence born of numerical parity and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Osbert and Aella had developed a coordinated battle plan that called for simultaneous attacks against multiple sections of the city's defences, preventing the Vikings from concentrating their forces effectively. The Anglo-Saxon leaders expected that their superior knowledge of York's defensive weaknesses would compensate for any disadvantages in equipment or tactical sophistication. The Battle of York, fought on March 21, 867 AD, became one of the most decisive engagements in early English history. The Viking defenders, commanded by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, had prepared extensively for the expected Anglo-Saxon counterattack. The city's defences had been strengthened with additional earthworks and obstacles, designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. Viking archers and crossbowmen occupied elevated positions that provided clear fields of fire across the approaches to the city walls. The initial Anglo-Saxon assault achieved limited success, as attacking forces breached the outer defensive works at several points. However, the Vikings had prepared layered defences that drew the attackers into increasingly disadvantageous positions. As Anglo-Saxon forces advanced through the breached sections, they encountered prepared obstacles including concealed pits, sharpened stakes, and carefully positioned stone barriers that disrupted their formations and exposed them to concentrated missile fire from Viking defenders. The decisive moment came when Ivar the Boneless ordered a coordinated counterattack that caught the Anglo-Saxon forces while they were engaged with the city's inner defences. Viking cavalry units, which had been concealed outside the city during the initial assault, struck the Anglo-Saxon flanks while infantry forces launched coordinated sorties from multiple gates. The combination of surprise, superior tactical coordination, and advantageous positioning proved overwhelming for the Anglo-Saxon army, whose formations disintegrated under the pressure of simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Both Osbert and Aella died during the battle, though the exact circumstances of their deaths remain disputed among contemporary sources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that both kings fell fighting bravely against overwhelming odds, while later Scandinavian sources provide more detailed accounts of their capture and execution. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield area suggests that the Anglo-Saxon leadership fought to the death rather than attempting to escape, indicating either exceptional courage or the recognition that capture would result in torture and humiliation. The destruction of the combined Anglo-Saxon army effectively ended organised resistance to Viking rule in Northumbria. The surviving Anglo-Saxon nobles either fled to neighbouring kingdoms or submitted to the new Scandinavian authorities in hopes of preserving their lands and status. The psychological impact of the defeat extended throughout northern England, as news of the disaster convinced many potential resistors that opposition to Viking conquest was futile. The great heathen army had achieved complete control over England's largest kingdom through a combination of strategic planning, tactical innovation, and ruthless exploitation of Anglo-Saxon political divisions. The complete subjugation of Northumbria provided the great heathen army with unprecedented strategic advantages for their next phase of conquest. The capture of Jorvik had yielded substantial wealth, while the destruction of both rival Anglo-Saxon claimants eliminated any possibility of organised resistance from the north. More significantly, the victory demonstrated to other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that the Vikings possessed both the military capability and political sophistication necessary to conquer and hold major territorial acquisitions. The psychological impact of Northumbria's fall reverberated throughout England, fundamentally altering the strategic calculations of remaining Anglo-Saxon rulers. The selection of Mercia as the next target reflected careful analysis by the Viking leadership of both opportunities and necessities. Mercia occupied the geographical heart of Anglo-Saxon England, controlling crucial river systems including the Trent, Severn and Upper Thames that provided access to virtually every other kingdom. The realm's extensive borders touched Wessex to the south, Wales to the west, and the remnants of various smaller kingdoms throughout central England. Control of Mercia would effectively isolate Wessex while providing the Vikings with secure supply lines, connecting their Northumbrian stronghold with potential future conquests in southern England. King Burgred of Mercia presented a more formidable opponent than the divided Northumbrian leadership had offered. Burgred had ruled since 852 AD and possessed extensive experience managing both internal political challenges and external military threats. His marriage to Ethelswith, sister of King Ethelred of Wessex, had created a formal alliance between the two most powerful remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This relationship provided Mercia with potential access to West Saxon military assistance, while offering Wessex strategic depth against Viking attacks from the north. The Mercian military organisation reflected the kingdom's position as the traditional hegemon of central England. Burgred commanded a standing army built around his personal retinue of approximately 800 professional warriors, supplemented by levies that could theoretically mobilise 4,000 to 5,000 additional fighters during major campaigns. The kingdom's military infrastructure included a network of fortified positions known as burhs, strategically positioned to control river crossings and major roadways throughout Mercian territory. These defensive installations had been constructed during the 8th century and represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering in contemporary Europe. The economic resources available to Mercia made the kingdom particularly attractive to Viking conquest ambitions. The realm's agricultural productivity, enhanced by extensive drainage projects in the river valleys, generated substantial grain surpluses that could support large military forces throughout extended campaigns. Mercian control of major trading routes connecting northern and southern England produced significant customs revenues, while the kingdom's silver mines in the Peak District provided access to the precious metals necessary for maintaining military forces and conducting diplomatic negotiations. The Viking approach to Mercia began during the summer of 867 AD with systematic intelligence gathering and preliminary raids designed to assess Anglo-Saxon defensive capabilities. Small Viking forces, typically numbering 200 to 300 warriors, struck targets throughout eastern Mercia while avoiding direct confrontation with major Anglo-Saxon armies. These reconnaissance operations provided detailed information about road networks, river crossings, and the location of defensive installations, while simultaneously testing Mercian response times and tactical doctrines. The main Viking advance into Mercia commenced in late autumn 867 AD, following established patterns of seasonal campaigning that had proved successful in Northumbria. The great heathen army moved southward from Jorvik along the Roman road network, with mounted scouts ranging far ahead of the main column to identify potential ambush sites and suitable defensive positions. The army's logistical organisation had evolved considerably since their initial landing in East Anglia, incorporating lessons learned from their successful Northumbrian campaign about the requirements for sustained territorial conquest. The Viking force that entered Mercia represented the most sophisticated military organisation operating in 9th century Europe. The army maintained its basic structure of Danish, Norwegian and Swedish contingents while developing specialised units optimised for specific tactical roles. Heavy cavalry equipped with mail armour and armed with long spears provided shock capability for battlefield engagements. Light cavalry units served reconnaissance and harassment functions, using composite bows and javelins to disrupt enemy formations while maintaining mobility advantages. Infantry forces included both heavily armed warriors capable of sustained melee combat and specialised units trained in siege warfare techniques. The march toward Nottingham proceeded through territory that had experienced minimal Viking activity during previous campaigns. The local population, while aware of events in Northumbria and East Anglia, had not yet experienced direct contact with Scandinavian military forces. This unfamiliarity worked to Viking advantage, as Anglo-Saxon civilians lacked practical knowledge about Viking tactical methods and often made strategic errors that facilitated conquest. Local resistance proved sporadic and ineffective, typically consisting of hastily organised militias that disbanded after brief contact with professional Viking forces. Nottingham occupied a strategically crucial position that made its capture essential for Viking control of central England. The settlement commanded the Trent River crossing at a point where multiple Roman roads converged, providing access to territories extending from the Welsh borders to the North Sea coast. The town's elevated position on sandstone cliffs offered natural defensive advantages, while its location at the junction of several river valleys provided multiple escape routes if retreat became necessary. Archaeological evidence suggests that Nottingham had been fortified since the 7th century, with successive generations of Anglo-Saxon rulers strengthening its defensive capabilities. The approach to Nottingham revealed the tactical evolution that had occurred within the great heathen army since their initial campaigns. Rather than attempting immediate assault against prepared defences, the Vikings established a comprehensive siege that combined military pressure with economic warfare designed to exhaust defender resources. The army constructed multiple fortified camps surrounding the town, each positioned to control specific approach routes while providing mutual support against potential relief expeditions. Viking engineers began systematic construction of siege equipment, including battering rams, catapults, and mobile towers that could bring attacking forces to the level of the defensive walls. The siege operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both military engineering and psychological warfare. Viking forces diverted water sources that supplied the town, forcing defenders to rely on internal wells and stored supplies that could not sustain a prolonged siege. Simultaneously, the attackers established a comprehensive blockade that prevented food, weapons, or reinforcements from reaching the defenders. The Vikings employed captured Anglo-Saxon prisoners to construct siege equipment under the observation of the town's defenders, creating psychological pressure while conserving their own manpower for combat operations. King Burgred's response to the Viking siege of Nottingham reflected both the strengths and limitations of 9th century Anglo-Saxon military organisation. The Mercian king recognised that the loss of such a strategically important position would compromise his ability to defend the remainder of his kingdom. However, Burgred also understood that direct assault against prepared Viking positions would likely result in catastrophic casualties that would leave Mercia defenceless against subsequent attacks. The king chose instead to seek military assistance from his West Saxon allies, while attempting to organise a relief expedition using forces drawn from throughout his kingdom. The diplomatic negotiations between Mercia and Wessex during the winter of 867-868 AD revealed the complex political calculations involved in Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking conquest. King Ethelred of Wessex faced pressure from his own nobles, many of whom argued that West Saxon resources should be preserved for defending their own territories rather than expended in foreign campaigns. However, Ethelred recognised that Mercian collapse would expose Wessex to direct Viking attack from multiple directions, making some level of military assistance strategically necessary, despite its immediate costs. The joint Anglo-Saxon relief expedition that assembled during early 868 AD represented the largest English military force mobilised since the Viking invasions began. The combined army included approximately 3,000 Mercian warriors under Burgred's direct command, supplemented by 2,000 West Saxon troops led by King Ethelred and his brother Alfred. Additional contingents from smaller kingdoms brought the total force to perhaps 6,000 warriors, creating rough numerical parity with the Viking besiegers. The Anglo-Saxon leadership developed coordinated battle plans that called for simultaneous attacks against multiple Viking positions, while relief forces attempted to break through to the besieged garrison. The Battle of Nottingham, fought in March 868 AD, demonstrated both the tactical sophistication that the great heathen army had achieved and the persistent limitations of Anglo-Saxon military doctrine. The Viking commanders, led by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, had prepared extensively for the expected relief attempt. The siege camps had been positioned not merely to contain the town's defenders, but to create advantageous positions for engaging relief forces. Viking cavalry units remained concealed in nearby woodland, ready to strike Anglo-Saxon flanks once the main engagement began. The initial Anglo-Saxon assault achieved limited success as attacking forces overran some of the outer Viking positions. However, the Vikings had prepared layered defences that drew the attackers into increasingly disadvantageous terrain while preserving their own tactical flexibility. As Anglo-Saxon forces advanced towards the main Viking camps, they encountered prepared obstacles, including concealed pits, sharpened stakes, and carefully positioned earthworks that disrupted their formations and exposed them to concentrated missile fire. The decisive moment came when Viking cavalry units emerged from concealment to strike the Anglo-Saxon flanks while the main engagement continued around the siege works. The combination of surprise, superior tactical coordination, and advantageous positioning proved overwhelming for portions of the Anglo-Saxon army. However, unlike previous engagements, the Anglo-Saxon forces maintained sufficient cohesion to conduct an organised withdrawal rather than suffering complete destruction. Both Burgred and Ethelred survived the battle, though their armies sustained casualties that significantly reduced their capacity for continued resistance. The aftermath of the Battle of Nottingham marked a crucial turning point in Viking conquest strategy. Rather than pursuing the retreating Anglo-Saxon forces, the Viking leadership chose to consolidate their territorial gains while opening diplomatic negotiations with the defeated kings. This decision reflected recognition that complete destruction of Anglo-Saxon military capacity might prove counterproductive, as the Vikings required cooperative local leadership to administer conquered territories effectively. The negotiations that followed established patterns of tribute payment and political subordination that would characterise Viking Anglo-Saxon relationships throughout the subsequent decade. The terms negotiated between the Vikings and King Burgred during the summer of 868 AD created a tributary relationship that preserved the formal structure of Mercian kingship, while ensuring Viking control over the kingdom's military and economic resources. Burgred retained his royal title and continued to exercise authority over internal Mercian affairs, but his foreign policy decisions required Viking approval. The agreement established regular tribute payments that included silver, agricultural products, and military equipment, while also requiring Mercian forces to provide assistance for future Viking campaigns against remaining independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The tribute system implemented in Mercia demonstrated the sophisticated administrative concepts that the Viking leadership had developed during their conquest campaigns. Rather than imposing direct military occupation throughout the kingdom, the Vikings established a network of fortified positions at strategic locations, while relying on cooperative Anglo-Saxon administrators to collect revenues and maintain order. This approach minimised the military resources required for territorial control while maximising the economic benefits of conquest. The system proved so effective that it became the standard model for Viking administration throughout their English territories. The economic exploitation of Mercia under Viking oversight began immediately following the establishment of tributary relationships. Scandinavian merchants and craftsmen received preferential access to Mercian markets, while Viking officials supervised the collection and distribution of agricultural surpluses. The kingdom's silver mines came under direct Viking control, with production quotas established to ensure steady supplies of precious metals for military and diplomatic purposes. These economic arrangements generated substantial revenues that supported continued Viking military operations, while providing incentives for Anglo-Saxon cooperation. The psychological impact of Mercia's subordination extended throughout remaining independent Anglo-Saxon territories. The kingdom's traditional role as the hegemon of central England meant that its submission to Viking authority fundamentally altered the political landscape of 9th century Britain. Smaller kingdoms that had previously looked to Mercia for protection against external threats now faced the choice between submission to Viking authority or attempting resistance with minimal external support. Most chose accommodation, recognising that opposition would likely result in the same military destruction that had befallen Northumbria. King Burgred's personal response to his kingdom's subordination revealed the complex emotional and political pressures facing Anglo-Saxon rulers during this period. Contemporary sources suggest that Burgred struggled with the humiliation of tributary status while recognising the practical impossibility of successful resistance. The king's relationship with his own nobles became increasingly strained as various factions advocated different approaches to Viking domination. Some Mercian thanes argued for continued cooperation in hopes of preserving their lands and status, while others advocated renewed resistance despite its obvious risks. The gradual erosion of Burgred's authority occurred over several years as Viking influence within Mercia expanded beyond the original tributary arrangements. Scandinavian advisors began participating in Mercian court proceedings, ostensibly to ensure compliance with tribute obligations, but effectively supervising all significant governmental decisions. Viking merchants established permanent operations in major Mercian towns, creating economic relationships that bound local populations to the new political order. The cumulative effect of these changes was to transform Mercia from an independent kingdom into a Viking protectorate. The crisis that ultimately led to Burgred's flight from England developed during 874 AD, as internal opposition to his rule combined with increasing Viking demands for expanded tribute payments. A faction of Mercian nobles led by Kjolwulf began advocating for Burgred's deposition in favour of a ruler who could provide more effective leadership against Viking domination. Simultaneously, the great heathen army increased its pressure on Mercia as part of preparations for renewed campaigns against Wessex, demanding additional warriors and supplies that strained the kingdom's resources beyond sustainable levels. The final confrontation between Burgred and his opponents occurred during the winter of 874 AD, when the king attempted to rally support for renewed resistance against Viking authority. However, years of tributary status had weakened both Mercian military capabilities and popular support for the monarchy. When Kjolwulf and his supporters openly challenged Burgred's authority, the king discovered that he lacked sufficient loyal forces to maintain his position. Rather than face capture and probable execution, Burgred chose exile, fleeing to Rome, where he spent his remaining years as a pensioner of the papal court. The installation of Kjolwulf II as Burgred's replacement demonstrated the sophisticated approach to governance that the Vikings had developed during their conquest campaigns. Rather than appointing a Scandinavian ruler who might provoke popular resistance, the Viking leadership selected an Anglo-Saxon noble whose genealogical claims provided legitimacy, while ensuring his dependence on continued Viking support. Kjolwulf possessed sufficient noble lineage to satisfy traditional requirements for kingship, but his political position remained entirely dependent on Viking approval and military backing. The administrative arrangements established under Kjolwulf II created a hybrid governmental system that preserved Anglo-Saxon legal and cultural traditions while ensuring Viking control over strategic decisions. Kjolwulf retained authority over internal Mercian affairs, including legal proceedings, religious matters, and local administration, but his foreign policy decisions required approval from Viking overlords. The new king's court included both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian officials, creating a bicultural administrative structure that facilitated communication between conquerors and conquered while maintaining effective governmental function. The tribute system expanded under Kjolwulf's rule as the Vikings systematized their economic exploitation of Mercian resources. Regular assessments determined the quantities of silver, grain, livestock, and manufactured goods that each region must provide to support Viking military operations. The system included provisions for additional levies during military campaigns, ensuring that Mercia would contribute both material resources and military personnel to future Viking conquests. These arrangements generated substantial revenues while creating economic relationships that bound Mercian populations to the Viking political order. The systematic consolidation of Mercia under Viking tributary control provided the great heathen army with the strategic foundation necessary for their most ambitious undertaking, the conquest of Wessex, the last major independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. By 869 AD, the Vikings controlled territory extending from the Scottish borders to the Thames Valley, commanding resources and manpower that dwarfed anything available to the West Saxon monarchy. The transformation of Mercia into a compliant client state had eliminated the buffer zone that previously protected Wessex from northern threats while providing the Vikings with secure supply lines and additional military levies for future campaigns. The West Saxon kingdom that faced Viking invasion in 870 AD represented the culmination of centuries of political and military evolution within Anglo-Saxon England. King Ethelred I, who had ruled since 865 AD, commanded a realm that stretched from the English Channel northward to the Thames Valley and westward to the Welsh borders. The kingdom's population approached 200,000 inhabitants, making it comparable in size to contemporary Frankish duchies and substantially larger than most Scandinavian political entities. This demographic advantage provided Wessex with potential military resources that exceeded Viking capabilities, though translating population into effective military power required sophisticated organisational systems that remained underdeveloped in 9th century England. The West Saxon military organisation reflected both traditional Anglo-Saxon structures and innovations developed in response to increasing Viking pressure. The feared system theoretically enabled the mobilisation of all free men for defensive warfare, though practical limitations meant that sustained campaigns relied primarily on the king's personal retinue and levies provided by major thanes. Archaeological evidence suggests that Wessex could field approximately 4,000 professional warriors supported by 8,000 to 10,000 militia fighters during major campaigns. However, these forces remained dispersed across the kingdom's extensive territories and required weeks to assemble for coordinated operations. The economic foundations of West Saxon resistance proved more robust than those available to previously conquered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The realm's agricultural productivity concentrated in the fertile river valleys of the Test, Itchen and Kennet, generated substantial grain surpluses that could sustain large armies throughout extended campaigns. The kingdom's position controlling cross-channel trade routes produced significant customs revenues, while silver mines in the Mendip Hills provided access to precious metals necessary for weapon production and diplomatic negotiations. These resources enabled Wessex to maintain military forces on a scale that matched Viking capabilities while supporting the administrative infrastructure necessary for effective resistance. The Viking preparation for the Wessex campaign revealed the organisational sophistication that the great Heathen army had achieved through their previous conquests. Intelligence gathering operations, conducted throughout 869 AD, provided detailed information about West Saxon defensive capabilities, political relationships, and economic vulnerabilities. Scandinavian merchants and craftsmen, operating under the protection of tributary arrangements in Mercia and East Anglia, established trading relationships that served as covers for military reconnaissance. These operations identified key river crossings, fortified positions, and supply depots that would prove crucial during subsequent military operations. The strategic planning process incorporated lessons learned from previous campaigns while adapting to the specific challenges posed by West Saxon resistance. Unlike Northumbria's political divisions or East Anglia's military weakness, Wessex presented a unified kingdom with experienced leadership and substantial military resources. The Viking commanders recognised that successful conquest would require systematic destruction of West Saxon military capacity, rather than the political manoeuvring that had proved effective elsewhere. This analysis led to the development of campaign plans that emphasised rapid territorial conquest combined with the elimination of Anglo-Saxon strongholds that could serve as centres of continued resistance. The invasion commenced during the winter months of 869. 870 AD, when the great Heathen army crossed the Thames at Reading, establishing a fortified base that controlled river traffic while providing secure communications with their Mercian territories. The selection of Reading reflected careful analysis of West Saxon defensive arrangements, as the town occupied a strategic position at the confluence of the Thames and Kennet rivers, while remaining sufficiently distant from major Anglo-Saxon strongholds to permit secure establishment of Viking operations. The crossing operation itself demonstrated the tactical innovations that distinguished this campaign from earlier Viking expeditions, with coordinated movements by multiple army divisions that prevented West Saxon forces from concentrating against any single crossing point. The fortification of Reading proceeded according to established Viking engineering principles, while incorporating modifications designed for extended territorial occupation. The army's engineers constructed earthwork defences that utilised the natural advantages provided by the river confluence, while creating multiple defensive lines that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The fortifications included provisions for naval operations, with protected harbours that could accommodate the Viking fleet, while providing secure supply routes connecting the base with territories under Scandinavian control. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Reading fortifications represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering undertaken by Viking forces in England. The West Saxon response to the Viking invasion revealed both the kingdom's military strengths and the persistent limitations of Anglo-Saxon tactical doctrine. King Ethelred I and his brother Alfred, who served as second-in-command, recognised that immediate action was necessary to prevent Viking consolidation of their Thames Valley bridgehead. The royal army, numbering approximately 3,000 warriors, advanced toward Reading within days of receiving reports about the Viking crossing. This rapid response reflected the superior communications and mobilisation systems that Wessex had developed during previous decades of external pressure. The initial engagement at Reading occurred on January 4, 871 AD, when advance elements of the West Saxon army encountered Viking forces constructing the outer defensive works. The battle demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred within both armies since their previous confrontations. The Vikings employed coordinated infantry and cavalry formations that maximised their advantages in mobility and weapon quality, while the Anglo-Saxons relied on traditional shield wall tactics that emphasised discipline and endurance over tactical flexibility. The engagement resulted in limited Viking tactical success, though neither side achieved decisive advantages that would determine the campaign's ultimate outcome. The psychological impact of the Reading engagement extended beyond its immediate tactical results, as both sides recognised that they faced opponents capable of sustained resistance. The Vikings discovered that West Saxon military capabilities exceeded those encountered in previous campaigns, while the Anglo-Saxons confirmed that Viking forces possessed the organisational sophistication necessary for territorial conquest rather than simple raiding. These realisations influenced subsequent strategic decisions by both sides, leading to more cautious approaches that emphasise preparation and coordination over rapid, decisive action. The Battle of Ashdown, fought on January 8, 871 AD, emerged as the most significant early engagement of the Wessex campaign and demonstrated the tactical innovations that would characterise subsequent Anglo-Saxon resistance efforts. The battle developed when West Saxon forces, commanded jointly by King Ethelred and Alfred, encountered the main Viking army positioned on the Berkshire Downs near modern-day Compton. The Vikings had selected defensive positions that utilised the natural advantages provided by elevated terrain, while maintaining access to supply routes connecting their forces with the Reading base. The Viking battle formation reflected the military sophistication that the great Heathen army had achieved through years of successful campaigning. The army deployed in two main divisions, with Halfdan Ragnarsson and Bagsek commanding the northern wing, while Ivar the Boneless and several other Jarls controlled the southern formation. Each division included balanced combinations of heavy infantry, light infantry, and cavalry units that could respond flexibly to changing tactical circumstances. The Vikings positioned their forces to take maximum advantage of the sloping terrain, creating overlapping fields of fire for their archers, while providing cavalry units with clear approach routes for flanking manoeuvres. The Anglo-Saxon approach to the Battle of Ashdown demonstrated significant tactical evolution from previous engagements, reflecting lessons learned during earlier confrontations with Viking forces. King Ethelred commanded the northern division of the West Saxon army, facing Halfdan's Vikings, while Alfred led the southern wing against the forces under Ivar's command. This division of command responsibilities enabled more flexible tactical responses while ensuring that both wings maintained coordination throughout the engagement. The Anglo-Saxon battle plan emphasised aggressive offensive action designed to prevent Viking forces from utilising their superior mobility and tactical flexibility. The decisive moment of the battle occurred when Alfred's division launched a coordinated assault against the Viking southern wing before Ethelred's forces had completed their preparations. This premature attack, which later sources suggest resulted from Alfred's tactical instincts rather than coordinated planning, caught the Vikings while they were still deploying from their march formation into battle array. The Anglo-Saxon assault struck the Viking line at its most vulnerable point, creating confusion and disorder that prevented effective tactical responses. Alfred's warriors pressed their advantage aggressively, breaking through Viking defensive formations and forcing Ivar's division into disorganized retreat. The success of Alfred's assault created opportunities for Ethelred's division to achieve similar tactical advantages against Halfdan's forces. The king's warriors, inspired by their comrades' success and facing Vikings, whose confidence had been shaken by the southern wing's collapse, launched their own coordinated attack that overwhelmed the remaining Viking positions. The combination of surprise, aggressive execution, and superior numbers proved decisive, resulting in the most significant Anglo-Saxon victory achieved since the Viking invasions began. The battle cost the Vikings substantial casualties, including several prominent jarls, while demonstrating that coordinated Anglo-Saxon resistance could achieve tactical success against even experienced Viking forces. The aftermath of Ashdown provided crucial strategic lessons that influenced subsequent developments throughout the Wessex campaign. The Vikings discovered that their previous tactical assumptions about Anglo-Saxon military capabilities required substantial revision, while the West Saxons gained confidence that sustained resistance could achieve meaningful results. However, both sides also recognised that single battle outcomes would not determine the campaign's ultimate conclusion, as the fundamental strategic advantages remained relatively balanced between the opposing forces. The Viking response to the Ashdown defeat revealed the tactical flexibility and strategic depth that made the great heathen army such a formidable opponent. Rather than attempting immediate retaliation that might compound their losses, the Viking leadership chose to consolidate their remaining forces while seeking reinforcements from territories under Scandinavian control. New contingents arrived from Denmark and the Viking territories in Ireland, bringing the army's strength back to levels comparable with their pre-battle capabilities. These reinforcements included experienced warriors familiar with siege warfare techniques that would prove crucial during subsequent phases of the campaign. The death of King Ethelred on April 23, 871 AD, created both opportunities and challenges for continued West Saxon resistance. Ethelred's death occurred following wounds received during the Battle of Merton, fought on March 22nd, where Viking forces had achieved tactical victory through superior coordination and battlefield mobility. The succession of Alfred to the West Saxon throne proceeded smoothly due to previous arrangements that recognised his military capabilities and popular support among the kingdom's warrior elite. However, Alfred inherited a realm whose military resources had been substantially depleted through months of continuous campaigning against Viking forces. Alfred's accession marked the beginning of a new phase in Anglo-Saxon resistance strategy that emphasised systematic military reform over traditional tactical approaches. The new king recognised that previous Anglo-Saxon defeats had resulted primarily from organisational and tactical limitations, rather than fundamental resource disadvantages. Alfred's early reforms focused on improving communication systems that could coordinate military responses across the kingdom's extensive territories while developing logistical capabilities that could sustain extended campaigns without depleting local agricultural resources. The development of the burr system represented Alfred's most significant innovation in defensive strategy, though its implementation required several years of careful planning and resource allocation. The concept involved establishing a network of fortified towns positioned to control major river crossings and road junctions throughout West Saxon territory. Each burh would maintain a permanent garrison capable of independent defensive action while providing secure bases for larger military operations. The system required substantial investment in construction materials, skilled labour, and ongoing maintenance, but offered the potential for coordinated defensive responses that could neutralise Viking mobility advantages. The initial burh construction began during 871, 872 AD with fortifications at strategic locations including Wallingford, Cricklade and Oxford. These installations utilised both natural defensive advantages and sophisticated engineering techniques that incorporated lessons learned from Viking siege warfare. The fortifications included multiple defensive lines, protected water supplies, and internal storage facilities that could sustain garrisons during extended siege operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that the early burhs represented some of the most advanced military architecture constructed in 9th century Europe. Alfred's naval reforms addressed another crucial limitation in previous Anglo-Saxon resistance efforts: the inability to contest Viking control of river and coastal transportation routes. The king initiated construction of a West Saxon fleet designed specifically to engage Viking longships in riverine and coastal environments. The new vessels incorporated design elements from captured Viking ships while adapting to Anglo-Saxon tactical requirements and available construction materials. The shipbuilding program required recruitment of experienced shipwrights from continental Europe, as Anglo-Saxon naval traditions had atrophied during previous centuries of land-based military focus. The tactical evolution of Anglo-Saxon military doctrine under Alfred's leadership reflected systematic analysis of previous defeats and careful study of successful Viking techniques. The king established training programs that taught West Saxon warriors to fight effectively in flexible formations, rather than relying exclusively on traditional shield wall tactics. These innovations included cavalry units equipped and trained according to Frankish models, archer formations capable of providing sustained missile support, and specialised siege warfare units that could operate effectively against fortified positions. The Viking adaptation to Alfred's military reforms demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had made the great heathen army successful throughout their English campaigns. Recognising that traditional raiding tactics would prove ineffective against the developing burh system, the Viking leadership began emphasising siege warfare techniques and coordinated operations designed to overwhelm individual fortifications before relief forces could arrive. The army's engineers developed portable siege equipment that could be transported rapidly between targets while maintaining the mobility advantages that form the foundation of Viking tactical doctrine. The campaign of 876-877 AD witnessed the most intensive phase of Viking operations against Alfred's reformed military system. The great heathen army, now commanded primarily by Guthrum, following the departure of other leaders to establish settlements in conquered territories, launched coordinated attacks against multiple burhs, while attempting to prevent Anglo-Saxon forces from achieving tactical concentration. The Vikings achieved initial success at several locations, demonstrating that individual fortifications remained vulnerable to determined assault by superior forces. However, the systematic nature of Alfred's defensive preparations gradually began to limit Viking operational effectiveness. The burh system created multiple secure bases that could support Anglo-Saxon military operations while denying the Vikings the rapid territorial conquest that had characterised their previous campaigns. West Saxon forces could now operate from fortified positions that provided both tactical advantages and logistical security, enabling sustained resistance efforts that gradually exhausted Viking resources and manpower. The crisis that ultimately led to the Treaty of Chippenham developed during the winter of 878 AD, when Guthrum attempted a final decisive campaign designed to destroy remaining West Saxon resistance. The Viking army launched surprise attacks against multiple targets throughout Wessex, while Alfred's forces remained dispersed in winter quarters. The initial Viking success forced Alfred to retreat to the Somerset marshes, where he established a temporary base at Athelney that provided security while enabling continued coordination of resistance efforts. The Battle of Edington, fought in May 878 AD, represented the culmination of 7 years of warfare between the great heathen army and Alfred's reformed military forces. The engagement occurred when Alfred's army, reinforced by levies from throughout Wessex, encountered Guthrum's forces positioned near modern-day Westbury. The battle demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred within both armies during their extended conflict, with sophisticated formations and coordinated manoeuvres that reflected years of military innovation and adaptation. The Anglo-Saxon victory at Edington resulted from superior tactical coordination combined with the cumulative effects of Alfred's military reforms. The West Saxon army employed flexible formations that neutralised Viking mobility advantages while maintaining sufficient cohesion to resist cavalry charges and flanking manoeuvres. The battle's outcome forced Guthrum to recognise that continued warfare would likely result in the destruction of his remaining forces without achieving meaningful territorial gains. The subsequent Treaty of Chippenham, negotiated during the summer of 878 AD, established the political framework that would govern Viking Anglo-Saxon relationships for the remainder of the 9th century. The agreement recognised Viking control over territories north and east of a boundary running roughly from London to Chester, creating the political entity known as the Danelaw. Simultaneously, the treaty confirmed Alfred's authority over remaining West Saxon territories while establishing diplomatic protocols that regulated trade, legal proceedings, and military activities across the boundary. The establishment of the Danelaw boundary through the Treaty of Chippenham marked a crucial inflection point in the Great Heathen Army's operational strategy, as the unified force that had terrorised Anglo-Saxon England for over a decade began to fragment along lines that reflected both practical necessities and fundamental disagreements about future objectives. The massive military confederation that had conquered kingdoms and reshaped the political landscape of 9th century Britain now faced internal pressures that would ultimately transform raiders into settlers and create the foundations for permanent Scandinavian communities throughout northern and eastern England. The decision to divide the Great Heathen Army emerged from a confluence of factors that had been building throughout the extended campaign against Alfred's reformed military system. Years of continuous warfare had exhausted both human and material resources, while the establishment of stable territorial boundaries reduced the immediate prospects for further profitable conquest. Many warriors who had joined the expedition, seeking rapid wealth through traditional raiding activities, found themselves committed to prolonged siege operations and administrative duties that offered limited opportunities for personal enrichment. The demographic composition of the army had also evolved significantly, as marriages with local women and the birth of children created family obligations that competed with military service for individual loyalties. The leadership tensions that precipitated the army's division reflected deeper philosophical differences about the ultimate objectives of Scandinavian expansion in England. Halfdan Ragnarsson, who had emerged as the dominant figure in Northumbrian affairs following the conquest of York, advocated for systematic colonisation that would create permanent Scandinavian territories capable of supporting large populations through agricultural production and trade. This vision required substantial investment in infrastructure development, legal systems, and administrative structures that could govern mixed populations of Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons. Halfdan's supporters included many warriors who had acquired local landholdings and established family relationships that bound them to specific geographical areas. Guthrum's faction maintained greater commitment to traditional Viking objectives of wealth extraction and territorial expansion, viewing the current territorial arrangements as temporary expedients rather than permanent settlements. His supporters included younger warriors who had joined the expedition, seeking adventure and enrichment, along with recent arrivals from Scandinavia who lacked the local connections that influenced Halfdan's followers. Guthrum's strategic vision emphasised maintaining military readiness for renewed campaigns against remaining Anglo-Saxon territories, particularly if political circumstances created opportunities for further conquest in Wessex or the Welsh kingdoms. The practical implications of these strategic disagreements became apparent during the winter planning sessions of 874 AD, when the army's leadership attempted to coordinate responses to Alfred's continuing military reforms. Halfdan's forces had become increasingly focused on defensive operations designed to protect established settlements and agricultural investments in Northumbrian territory. His warriors had developed local knowledge and relationships that made them highly effective at maintaining control over conquered populations, but reduced their mobility and availability for extended campaigns in distant territories. The gradual transformation from mobile raiders to territorial defenders represented a fundamental shift in military priorities that created operational constraints for the unified army. Guthrum's contingents retained greater tactical flexibility and mobility, but faced increasing logistical challenges as their traditional supply networks became disrupted by the establishment of permanent territorial boundaries. The warriors under his command required regular infusions of wealth and supplies that could only be obtained through continued military operations, yet the stabilisation of Anglo-Saxon resistance under Alfred's leadership had reduced opportunities for profitable raiding. The tension between military necessity and available resources created pressures that could only be resolved through either renewed territorial expansion or fundamental changes in operational strategy. The formal division of the Great Heathen Army occurred during the spring of 874 AD, when Halfdan announced his intention to lead his followers northward to establish permanent settlements in Northumbrian territory. This decision represented more than a simple redistribution of military forces. It constituted a fundamental transformation in the nature of Scandinavian presence in England. Halfdan's departure, with approximately 3,000 warriors and their families, marked the end of the unified military confederation that had dominated English affairs for nearly a decade, while simultaneously beginning the process of systematic colonisation that would create lasting Scandinavian communities throughout northern England. The land distribution process that followed Halfdan's return to Northumbria revealed sophisticated understanding of both agricultural requirements and political necessities involved in successful colonisation. The Viking leadership recognised that sustainable settlement required more than simple military occupation. It demanded the creation of economic relationships that could support large populations while maintaining political stability among conquered Anglo-Saxon communities. The distribution system that emerged incorporated elements of traditional Scandinavian land tenure with practical adaptations designed for the specific circumstances of colonial administration. The archaeological evidence from Scandinavian settlement sites throughout Yorkshire and Lincolnshire provides detailed information about the land allocation methods employed by Halfdan's forces. Individual warriors typically received holdings ranging from 30 to 120 acres, depending on their military rank and family circumstances, with additional common lands available for grazing livestock and gathering timber. The distribution process prioritised fertile river valley locations that could support intensive agricultural production, while also ensuring that each settlement maintained defensive positions that could resist potential Anglo-Saxon counterattacks. The resulting settlement pattern created a network of fortified agricultural communities that could provide mutual support while maintaining economic productivity. The transformation of Viking warriors into agricultural settlers required substantial adaptations in both lifestyle and social organisation. Many Scandinavian colonists possessed limited experience with the intensive farming techniques necessary for successful agriculture in English soil and climate conditions. The settlement process therefore incorporated extensive cooperation with existing Anglo-Saxon populations, whose agricultural knowledge proved essential for successful crop production. This collaboration created complex social relationships that blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon cultural elements, while establishing new forms of economic organisation that differed significantly from traditional patterns in either society. The legal frameworks developed for governing mixed Scandinavian Anglo-Saxon communities reflected pragmatic approaches to the challenges of colonial administration. Halfdan's administration established court systems that incorporated elements of both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, creating hybrid institutions that could resolve disputes involving members of both communities. The resulting legal codes addressed issues ranging from property rights and inheritance procedures to criminal penalties and commercial regulations, establishing precedents that would influence legal development throughout the Danelaw territories for centuries. The linguistic impact of mass Scandinavian settlement became apparent within decades of the initial colonisation, as extensive contact between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations created new dialectical variations that incorporated elements from both language families. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites indicates that bilingual communication became common in areas with substantial Scandinavian populations, leading to the development of creolized languages that facilitated trade and administration, while preserving distinct cultural identities. The linguistic changes extended beyond simple vocabulary borrowing to include fundamental alterations in grammatical structures and pronunciation patterns that would permanently influence the development of English language in northern regions. The economic transformation of Northumbrian territory under Scandinavian settlement demonstrated the productive potential of systematic colonisation when supported by adequate planning and resources. The Viking settlers introduced agricultural techniques and crop varieties that increased overall productivity, while developing new forms of craft production that served both local needs and export markets. Archaeological evidence indicates that metalworking, textile production and pottery manufacture all expanded significantly during the initial settlement period, creating economic foundations that could support larger populations while generating surplus wealth for trade with other regions. The urban development that accompanied rural settlement revealed the sophisticated planning capabilities that Halfdan's administration had developed during years of military campaigning. The expansion of York into the major trading centre of Jorvik required substantial investment in infrastructure, including harbour facilities, market buildings, and residential areas capable of accommodating diverse populations. The city's growth attracted merchants and craftsmen from throughout Northern Europe, creating cosmopolitan communities that served as conduits for cultural and economic exchange between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon societies. While Halfdan's followers established permanent settlements in Northumbrian territory, Guthrum's continued military operations in East Anglia and periodic campaigns against Wessex demonstrated the persistent viability of traditional Viking strategies under appropriate circumstances. The forces remaining under Guthrum's command, numbering approximately 4,000 warriors, retained the mobility and tactical flexibility that had characterized the original Great Heathen army while adapting to the changed strategic environment created by Alfred's military reforms and the establishment of territorial boundaries. Guthrum's administrative approach in East Anglia differed significantly from Halfdan's colonisation strategy, emphasising the extraction of wealth and resources rather than permanent settlement and agricultural development. The East Anglian territories under Viking control functioned primarily as military bases and supply centres that could support continued operations against remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This approach required different organisational structures and administrative systems that prioritised military efficiency over long-term economic development or cultural integration. The tactical innovations developed by Guthrum's forces during their continued campaigns revealed the adaptability that had made Viking military organisation so effective throughout the conquest period. Recognising that traditional raiding techniques had become less effective against Alfred's Burr system, Guthrum's commanders developed new approaches that emphasised coordinated siege operations and systematic territorial control. These innovations included the development of portable siege equipment, improved cavalry tactics, and logistical systems that could support extended operations in hostile territory. The naval capabilities maintained by Guthrum's forces provided crucial advantages for continued military operations along England's eastern coastline. The Viking fleet, based primarily at Thetford and other East Anglian ports, could transport forces rapidly between threatened areas while maintaining supply lines connecting Viking territories with Scandinavian homelands. The naval component also enabled raids against coastal targets that remained vulnerable despite Alfred's defensive innovations, providing opportunities for wealth acquisition that could sustain military operations during periods when land-based campaigns proved unprofitable. The diplomatic relationships that Guthrum maintained with various Anglo-Saxon authorities demonstrated the complex political calculations involved in 9th century warfare. While formal hostilities continued with Wessex, Guthrum's administration established trading relationships and diplomatic protocols with other Anglo-Saxon territories that provided mutual benefits while avoiding unnecessary military confrontations. These arrangements enable the continued functioning of commercial networks that had been disrupted by years of warfare, while providing Viking authorities with intelligence about political developments throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The religious and cultural tensions that characterised Guthrum's later career reflected the broader challenges facing Scandinavian leaders who sought to establish permanent authority over predominantly Christian populations. The traditional Viking religious practices that had provided cultural cohesion during military campaigns became potential sources of conflict when applied to territorial administration over Anglo-Saxon subjects. The pressure to adopt Christianity therefore represented both a practical political necessity and a fundamental challenge to traditional Scandinavian cultural identity. The circumstances surrounding Guthrum's conversion to Christianity in 878 AD revealed the pragmatic calculations that often influenced religious decisions among Viking leaders. The conversion occurred as part of the broader diplomatic settlement with Alfred that established the Danelaw boundaries, indicating that religious considerations remained subordinate to political and military necessities. However, the conversion also reflected recognition that successful long-term administration of predominantly Christian territories required religious legitimacy that traditional Scandinavian practices could not provide. The baptismal ceremony that formalised Guthrum's conversion took place at Aller in Somerset, with Alfred serving as his godfather in a symbolic gesture that emphasised the personal relationship between the two former enemies. The religious ritual included the adoption of the Christian name Ethelstan, which connected Guthrum to Anglo-Saxon royal traditions while maintaining his authority over Viking followers. The ceremony attracted substantial attention from both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon observers, creating precedents that would influence subsequent conversions among Viking leaders throughout the Danelaw territories. The administrative changes that followed Guthrum's conversion demonstrated the practical implications of religious transformation for Viking territorial governance. Christian religious authorities gained official recognition within East Anglian territories under Viking control, while traditional Scandinavian religious practices faced increasing restrictions. The changes extended beyond purely religious matters to include legal procedures, educational systems, and cultural celebrations that reflected the growing influence of Christian traditions among both Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon subjects. The cultural synthesis that emerged from the interaction between Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon populations created new forms of artistic expression, architectural styles, and literary traditions that incorporated elements from both cultural backgrounds. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites throughout the Danelaw territories reveals the development of hybrid material cultures that combined Scandinavian metalworking techniques with Anglo-Saxon decorative motifs, creating distinctive regional variations that reflected local cultural negotiations between different ethnic communities. The linguistic changes that accompanied cultural synthesis extended beyond simple vocabulary borrowing to include fundamental alterations in grammatical structures and phonetic patterns. The intensive contact between Old Norse and Old English speakers created conditions that facilitated rapid linguistic change, particularly in areas with substantial Scandinavian settlement. These changes included the adoption of Scandinavian pronouns, prepositions, and verb forms that would permanently influence the development of English language in northern and eastern regions. The economic networks that developed to serve mixed Scandinavian Anglo-Saxon communities created new forms of commercial organisation that differed from traditional patterns in both societies. The combination of Scandinavian maritime expertise with Anglo-Saxon agricultural productivity generated trading relationships that connected local communities with commercial networks, extending throughout northern Europe. Archaeological evidence indicates that these trading connections brought exotic goods including amber, furs and precious metals into English territories while exporting agricultural products, textiles and manufactured goods to Scandinavian markets. The technological innovations that emerged from cultural contact between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon communities demonstrated the productive potential of peaceful interaction between different ethnic groups. The combination of Scandinavian metalworking expertise with Anglo-Saxon agricultural knowledge created new tools and techniques that increased productivity in both farming and craft production. These innovations included improved plough designs, more efficient ironworking methods, and new approaches to textile production that enhanced the economic foundations of settlement communities. The political structures that evolved within the Danelaw territories reflected the practical necessities of governing diverse populations while maintaining connections with Scandinavian homelands. The administrative systems that emerged incorporated traditional Anglo-Saxon institutions with Scandinavian leadership structures, creating hybrid governmental forms that could address local needs while preserving cultural identities. These political arrangements established precedents for multicultural governance that would influence political development throughout medieval England. The political arrangements established through the Treaty of Chippenham created unprecedented administrative challenges as Scandinavian leaders confronted the practical realities of governing territories that encompassed hundreds of thousands of Anglo-Saxon subjects alongside growing populations of Norse settlers. The transformation from military conquest to territorial administration required sophisticated legal frameworks, economic systems, and cultural institutions that could maintain stability while preserving the essential characteristics that distinguish Scandinavian society from its Anglo-Saxon counterpart. The solutions that emerged during the final decades of the 9th century established enduring patterns of governance that would influence political development throughout medieval England. The administrative structure that evolved within the Danelaw territories reflected careful adaptation of existing Anglo-Saxon governmental institutions to serve Scandinavian political objectives. Rather than imposing entirely foreign systems that might provoke resistance, Viking administrators preserved local administrative divisions, including shires and hundreds, while installing Scandinavian officials in positions of ultimate authority. The shire system continued to function as the primary unit of local government, though shire reeves now answered to Scandinavian jarls rather than Anglo-Saxon aldermen. This hybrid approach enabled efficient collection of taxes and maintenance of order, while minimising disruption to established patterns of daily life that had evolved over centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule. The legal systems established throughout Scandinavian territories demonstrated remarkable sophistication in balancing competing cultural traditions while creating coherent frameworks for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. The Viking administrators recognised that successful governance required legal codes that commanded respect from both Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon subjects, necessitating careful integration of Norse and English legal traditions. The resulting legal framework incorporated Scandinavian concepts of personal honour and compensation, alongside Anglo-Saxon precedents regarding property rights and commercial regulations. Court proceedings typically included both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon officials, ensuring that legal decisions reflected understanding of both cultural perspectives while maintaining consistency with established precedents. The Wergild system, which assigned monetary values to individuals based on their social status, underwent significant modification to accommodate the complex social hierarchies that emerged from Scandinavian settlement. Traditional Anglo-Saxon Wergild calculations had distinguished primarily between nobles, free farmers, and slaves, with compensation rates reflecting these basic social divisions. The Scandinavian legal framework introduced additional categories that recognised the status of Norse settlers, professional warriors, and various categories of craftsmen whose social positions did not correspond directly to traditional Anglo-Saxon classifications. The resulting system created compensation schedules that reflected the multicultural nature of Danelaw society, while maintaining principles of proportional justice that both communities could accept. Property law represented another area where Scandinavian administrators developed innovative solutions to accommodate competing cultural traditions. Anglo-Saxon property concepts emphasized inherited landholding tied to specific family lineages, while Scandinavian traditions placed greater emphasis on acquired property rights based on conquest or purchase. The hybrid system that emerged recognized both inherited Anglo-Saxon holdings and newly acquired Scandinavian properties, creating legal frameworks that protected established rights while enabling continued land distribution to Norse settlers. The resulting property law established precedents for land tenure that incorporated elements of both feudal obligation and individual ownership, creating flexible arrangements that could adapt to changing demographic and economic conditions. Commercial law underwent substantial development as Scandinavian administrators sought to promote trade relationships that could generate revenue while supporting the diverse economic activities of mixed populations. The legal codes established standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade across cultural boundaries, while creating dispute resolution mechanisms that could address conflicts between merchants from different ethnic backgrounds. Market regulations ensured fair trading practices while protecting both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon commercial interests. The development of commercial law reflected recognition that economic prosperity required legal frameworks that encouraged trade and investment while preventing exploitation of either ethnic community. The integration of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations proceeded through multiple mechanisms that created opportunities for cultural exchange while preserving distinct ethnic identities. Intermarriage between Scandinavian men and Anglo-Saxon women became increasingly common, particularly among the warrior class who had acquired substantial landholdings and sought to establish family connections that could strengthen their local political positions. These marriages created kinship networks that bridged ethnic divisions, while producing children whose mixed heritage enabled them to serve as cultural intermediaries between different communities. The offspring of such unions typically received education in both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon cultural traditions, creating a generation that possessed the linguistic and cultural skills necessary for effective administration of diverse populations. The settlement patterns that emerged throughout the Danelaw territories reflected deliberate planning designed to maximise both agricultural productivity and defensive capabilities while facilitating cultural integration. Scandinavian settlers typically established homesteads in close proximity to existing Anglo-Saxon villages, creating mixed communities that encouraged daily interaction between different ethnic groups. The physical layout of these settlements incorporated both Scandinavian longhouse, architectural traditions, and Anglo-Saxon building techniques, producing distinctive regional styles that reflected local cultural negotiations. Archaeological evidence indicates that shared facilities including mills, markets, and religious buildings served both ethnic communities, creating institutional foundations for ongoing cultural exchange. The agricultural techniques employed by Scandinavian settlers incorporated innovations that increased overall productivity while adapting traditional Norse farming methods to English soil and climate conditions. The heavy plough technology that Scandinavian settlers introduced proved particularly effective in the clay soils common throughout Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, enabling cultivation of previously marginal lands that could support larger populations. The three-field crop rotation system that emerged from the combination of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon agricultural knowledge increased grain yields while maintaining soil fertility through systematic fallowing and fertilization. These agricultural innovations supported population growth that strengthened Scandinavian communities while generating surplus production that could sustain urban populations and support craft specialization. Livestock management represented another area where cultural exchange produced beneficial innovations. Scandinavian settlers brought expertise in horse breeding and cattle management that complemented Anglo-Saxon knowledge of sheep farming and swine husbandry. The resulting agricultural systems incorporated diverse livestock populations that provided multiple sources of protein, leather, and wool, while creating manure supplies that enhanced crop production. The integration of different livestock management traditions created more resilient agricultural systems that could maintain productivity during adverse weather conditions, while providing diverse economic opportunities for farming communities. The economic transformation of the Danelaw territories encompassed both agricultural and commercial developments that created new forms of wealth generation and distribution. The establishment of regular markets in major settlements provided venues for trade between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon communities, while attracting merchants from throughout northern Europe. Archaeological evidence from market sites indicates that commercial activity expanded significantly during the late 9th century, with increased quantities of imported goods including amber, furs, and precious metals entering English territories through Scandinavian trading networks. The expansion of commercial activity created opportunities for craft specialization that supported urban growth, while providing employment for populations that exceeded agricultural labour requirements. The development of specialised craft production reflected both technological innovations and expanded market opportunities created by cultural integration. Metalworking techniques that combined Scandinavian expertise in iron production with Anglo-Saxon knowledge of decorative arts produced distinctive regional styles that commanded premium prices in both local and export markets. Textile production incorporated Scandinavian weaving techniques with Anglo-Saxon wool processing methods, creating high-quality fabrics that served both domestic consumption and commercial export. The combination of different technological traditions created competitive advantages that enabled Danelaw craftsmen to compete effectively with producers from other regions while developing distinctive regional specializations. The monetary systems that evolved within Scandinavian territories demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the requirements for stable currency that could facilitate both local trade and international commerce. The continuation of Anglo-Saxon silver penny production under Scandinavian authority maintained monetary stability while adapting coin designs to reflect new political realities. Scandinavian rulers issued coins that incorporated both Norse and Anglo-Saxon design elements, creating currency that commanded acceptance throughout the Danelaw territories while maintaining compatibility with broader European monetary systems. The monetary reforms included standardization of silver content and weight specifications that enhanced confidence in Danelaw currency while facilitating trade relationships with continental European partners. Urban development accelerated throughout the Danelaw territories as commercial expansion and population growth created demands for specialised services and administrative facilities. The transformation of York into the major commercial centre of Jorvik required substantial investment in infrastructure, including expanded harbour facilities, warehouse construction, and residential areas capable of accommodating diverse populations. Archaeological evidence indicates that the city's population may have doubled during the late 9th century, creating one of the largest urban centres in contemporary northern Europe. The urban expansion attracted merchants, craftsmen, and administrators from throughout the region, creating cosmopolitan communities that served as centres for cultural and economic exchange. The harbour improvements at Jorvik reflected sophisticated understanding of the requirements for supporting large-scale commercial operations. The construction of stone quays and wooden piers enabled the accommodation of larger vessels while providing secure facilities for loading and unloading cargo. Warehouse construction incorporated both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon architectural techniques, creating storage facilities that could protect valuable goods while facilitating efficient distribution to regional markets. The harbour facilities included specialised areas for different types of cargo, with separate sections for grain storage, metalworking materials, and luxury goods that required enhanced security measures. The residential expansion that accompanied commercial growth created distinctive urban neighbourhoods that reflected the cultural diversity of Jorvik's population. Scandinavian settlers typically constructed houses based on traditional longhouse designs, though adapted to urban space constraints and local building materials. Anglo-Saxon residents maintained their preference for smaller individual dwellings, creating mixed neighbourhoods where different architectural styles coexisted within the same districts. The resulting urban landscape reflected ongoing cultural negotiations, while demonstrating the practical accommodations that enabled different ethnic communities to share urban space effectively. Religious changes throughout the Danelaw territories occurred gradually as Scandinavian settlers encountered Christian institutions while maintaining connections to traditional Norse religious practices. The conversion process typically began with pragmatic accommodations that enabled Scandinavian leaders to govern predominantly Christian populations, while preserving cultural elements that maintained their authority among Norse followers. Many Scandinavian settlers adopted Christian practices for public purposes, while continuing to observe traditional Norse rituals in private settings, creating syncretic religious traditions that incorporated elements from both belief systems. The Christian church hierarchy that emerged within Scandinavian territories reflected the political realities of governance by non-Christian rulers who gradually adopted Christian practices for administrative convenience. Existing Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastical institutions continued to function under Scandinavian oversight, though with reduced political influence and modified liturgical practices that accommodated Norse cultural preferences. The appointment of bishops and other church officials required approval from Scandinavian authorities, ensuring that religious leadership remained compatible with secular political objectives while maintaining spiritual authority among Christian populations. The monastery system underwent significant transformation as Scandinavian rulers sought to extract economic benefits from ecclesiastical institutions while preserving their religious functions. Many monasteries that had accumulated substantial landholdings and wealth over centuries of Anglo-Saxon patronage found themselves subject to taxation and military obligations that had not previously applied to religious institutions. However, Scandinavian administrators also recognised the educational and administrative capabilities that monastic communities possessed, leading to collaborative relationships that utilised ecclesiastical expertise for secular governmental purposes. The gradual Christianisation of Scandinavian settlers occurred through multiple mechanisms that enabled religious conversion while preserving cultural identity and social cohesion. Intermarriage with Christian Anglo-Saxon partners created family pressures for religious conversion, while the practical advantages of Christian religious affiliation in predominantly Christian territories provided incentives for individual conversion decisions. The conversion process typically involved adoption of Christian ritual practices while maintaining Norse cultural traditions in areas not directly related to religious observance, creating hybrid cultural identities that preserved essential elements of Scandinavian heritage. The architectural developments that accompanied religious change reflected the complex negotiations between Christian and Norse cultural traditions. Church construction within Scandinavian territories incorporated traditional Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastical architecture with decorative elements that reflected Norse artistic preferences. The resulting religious buildings demonstrated cultural synthesis while maintaining the functional requirements necessary for Christian worship. Archaeological evidence indicates that some religious sites included both Christian and Norse religious symbols, suggesting that religious conversion occurred gradually rather than through complete abandonment of traditional practices. The educational systems that developed within Scandinavian territories addressed the practical requirements for training administrators and clergy who could serve mixed populations effectively. The establishment of schools that taught both Latin literacy and runic writing systems enabled the development of administrative cadres capable of communicating with diverse constituencies while maintaining records in multiple writing systems. These educational institutions typically operated under ecclesiastical auspices while serving secular administrative purposes, creating collaborative relationships between religious and political authorities that enhance governmental effectiveness. The legal codification that occurred during the late 9th century established written records of the hybrid legal systems that had evolved through practical application during the settlement period. The production of written legal codes required collaboration between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon legal experts who possessed the linguistic and cultural knowledge necessary for accurate translation and interpretation of different legal traditions. The resulting legal documents established precedents that influenced legal development throughout medieval England, while preserving distinctive regional characteristics that reflected local cultural negotiations. The preservation of Norse cultural traditions occurred through multiple mechanisms that enabled Scandinavian communities to maintain ethnic identity while adapting to English territorial circumstances. Oral traditions, including sagas, poetry, and historical narratives, continued to be transmitted within Scandinavian families and communities, preserving cultural knowledge and values that distinguished Norse settlers from their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. These cultural practices included traditional crafts, seasonal celebrations, and social customs that maintained connections to Scandinavian homelands while adapting to local circumstances and available materials. The stability that had characterised the Danelaw territories during the 880s faced its greatest challenge when substantial Viking reinforcements arrived on English shores in 892 AD, bringing with them renewed ambitions for territorial expansion and the military capability to challenge the defensive systems that Alfred had spent decades perfecting. This second wave of Scandinavian invasion differed fundamentally from the original Great Heathen Army in both composition and strategic objectives, representing a convergence of displaced warriors from continental campaigns and opportunistic adventurers seeking to exploit the established Norse presence in England for their own territorial ambitions. The leader of this renewed offensive was Heathen, a veteran Viking commander whose reputation had been forged through decades of successful campaigns across the Frankish territories and the Mediterranean. Heathen's military experience encompassed siege warfare against heavily fortified Carolingian cities, naval operations in the confined waters of the Seine and Loire rivers, and the complex logistics required for maintaining large armies during extended campaigns far from their home bases. His arrival in England represented the convergence of continental Viking military expertise with the territorial opportunities created by the established Scandinavian presence in northern and eastern England. The force that Hastein commanded numbered approximately 7,000 warriors, accompanied by their families and support personnel, creating a military migration that totaled perhaps 15,000 individuals seeking new homes and opportunities. This army differed significantly from the original Great Heathen Army in its demographic composition, including substantial numbers of warriors who had been displaced from Frankish territories by the military reforms of Charles the Fat and the increasing effectiveness of Carolingian defensive strategies. Many of these veterans possessed extensive experience with siege warfare techniques that had been developed during campaigns against the sophisticated fortifications of Frankish cities, bringing tactical knowledge that would prove crucial during subsequent operations against Alfred's Burh system. The fleet that transported Hastine's forces represented one of the largest naval expeditions mounted by Scandinavian forces during the 9th century. Contemporary sources record the presence of over 250 vessels of various sizes, ranging from massive dragon ships capable of carrying 80 warriors to smaller coastal vessels designed for reconnaissance and supply transport. The fleet's composition reflected the international character of Hastein's following, including ships constructed in Danish, Norwegian, and Frankish shipyards, each incorporating different design elements that reflected regional shipbuilding traditions and tactical preferences. The diversity of vessel types provided Hastine's forces with exceptional flexibility for operations in different maritime environments, from open sea crossings to riverine penetration deep into English territory. The landing sites selected by Hastine's forces demonstrated sophisticated intelligence about English coastal defences and the strategic situation that had evolved since the establishment of the Danelaw boundaries. The main force made landfall at Appledore in Kent, establishing a fortified base that controlled access to the Romney Marsh, while providing secure communications with the continent. Simultaneously, a secondary force under Hastein's direct command landed at Milton Regis, creating a second operational base that threatened Canterbury and the approaches to London. The coordination of these simultaneous landings indicated careful planning that incorporated detailed knowledge of English defensive preparations and the locations of Alfred's Burh network. The fortifications constructed by Hastine's forces at their landing sites incorporated lessons learned from decades of siege warfare against Carolingian defences, creating some of the most sophisticated military engineering seen in 9th century England. The Appledore fortifications utilised the natural defensive advantages provided by the coastal marshes while incorporating multiple defensive lines that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The earthwork construction included angled bastions that provided overlapping fields of fire for archers and crossbowmen, while the wooden palisades incorporated techniques for rapid repair and reinforcement during siege operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that these fortifications surpassed even Alfred's Burh constructions in their technical sophistication and defensive capabilities. The strategic coordination between Hastine's new arrivals and the established Scandinavian populations in the Danelaw territories created unprecedented challenges for Alfred's defensive strategy. The existing Norse settlements provided potential sources of supply, reinforcement, and intelligence that could support extended operations by the new Viking forces. However, the relationship between the established settlers and the new arrivals proved more complex than either Alfred or Hastein had anticipated, as the territorial interests of the settled populations did not necessarily align with the conquest ambitions of the recent immigrants. The established Scandinavian communities in Yorkshire and East Anglia had invested substantial resources in agricultural development and commercial relationships that could be jeopardised by renewed warfare with Wessex. Many of the settled Vikings had developed economic interests that depended on peaceful trade relationships with Anglo-Saxon territories, while their agricultural investments required stable political conditions to generate sustainable returns. The prospect of renewed military campaigns that might provoke West Saxon retaliation against established Norse settlements created tensions within the Scandinavian community that would influence subsequent military operations. Alfred's response to the renewed Viking threat demonstrated the military sophistication that West Saxon forces had achieved through 2 decades of continuous warfare and systematic reform. The King's intelligence network, developed through years of border conflicts with the Danelaw territories, provided detailed information about Hastings' forces and their strategic capabilities. Alfred's scouts reported the size and composition of the Viking army within days of their landing, enabling rapid mobilization of West Saxon forces and coordination with allied Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that recognized the threat posed by renewed Scandinavian expansion. The military reforms that Alfred implemented in response to Hastings' invasion represented the culmination of decades of tactical innovation and organizational development. The West Saxon army that assembled to confront the new Viking threat incorporated professional standing forces with improved militia levies, creating a military organization capable of sustained operations against experienced opponents. The standing army included approximately 2,000 professional warriors equipped with standardized weapons and armor, supported by specialized units, including cavalry formations trained in continental fighting techniques and siege engineers capable of constructing and operating complex military equipment. The burr system that formed the foundation of Alfred's defensive strategy had evolved considerably since its initial implementation during the 870s. The network now encompassed over 30 fortified positions strategically located to control river crossings, major roadways and agricultural centres throughout West Saxon territory. Each burh maintained permanent garrisons ranging from 200 to 800 warriors, depending on the strategic importance of the location and the size of the civilian population requiring protection. The fortifications incorporated multiple defensive innovations including stone walls, complex gate systems, and internal water supplies that could sustain prolonged siege operations. The tactical coordination between different burhs enabled defensive responses that could neutralize the mobility advantages traditionally enjoyed by Viking forces. The communication systems connecting the various fortifications included signal fires, mounted messengers, and pre-positioned supply depots that enabled rapid concentration of forces at threatened locations. The defensive network created overlapping zones of control that prevented Viking forces from moving freely through West Saxon territory, while providing secure bases for offensive operations against Scandinavian positions. The siege warfare capabilities that Alfred's forces had developed represented perhaps the most significant tactical innovation in Anglo-Saxon military doctrine. The West Saxon army included specialized engineering units trained in the construction and operation of catapults, battering rams and siege towers that could challenge even sophisticated Viking fortifications. The engineering knowledge incorporated lessons learned from captured Viking equipment and techniques observed during previous campaigns, adapted to Anglo-Saxon tactical requirements and available materials. These capabilities enabled West Saxon forces to conduct offensive operations against fortified Viking positions rather than relying exclusively on defensive strategies. The initial campaign phase began in late 892 AD when Hastings' forces launched coordinated attacks against multiple targets throughout Kent and Essex. The Viking strategy emphasized rapid territorial conquest that could establish secure supply lines, connecting their coastal bases with potential allies in the established Danelaw territories. The attacks targeted both fortified positions and agricultural centres, seeking to disrupt West Saxon defensive preparations while acquiring the resources necessary for sustained military operations. The coordination of simultaneous attacks against multiple targets, demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Hastings' forces had achieved through their continental campaigns. The Siege of Rochester represented the first major engagement between Hastings' forces and Alfred's reformed military system. The Viking army invested the fortified town with approximately 4,000 warriors, employing siege techniques that incorporated both traditional Scandinavian methods and innovations developed during Frankish campaigns. The attackers constructed elaborate earthworks that protected their forces while providing platforms for siege engines, including catapults capable of hurling stones weighing over 200 pounds against the town's defensive walls. The siege operations revealed the technical expertise that continental Viking forces had acquired through years of warfare against sophisticated opponents. The defence of Rochester demonstrated the effectiveness of Alfred's military reforms when properly coordinated and supplied. The town's garrison, numbering approximately 600 warriors, maintained effective resistance for over 6 weeks, despite facing overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The defensive strategy incorporated multiple fallback positions within the town's fortifications, enabling the garrison to continue fighting even after the Vikings breached the outer walls. The prolonged resistance provided time for relief forces to assemble while inflicting substantial casualties on the attacking Viking army. The relief expedition that ultimately broke the siege of Rochester represented one of the largest military operations undertaken by Anglo-Saxon forces during the 9th century. Alfred personally commanded a combined army that included West Saxon forces, Mercian allies, and contingents from other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that recognised the strategic threat posed by Hastings' invasion. The relief army numbered approximately 8,000 warriors, creating rough numerical parity with the Viking forces, while providing advantages in local knowledge and supply arrangements that would prove decisive during subsequent operations. The Battle of the Medway, fought during the approach to Rochester, demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred within both Anglo-Saxon and Viking military organisations since their previous major confrontations. The engagement began when Viking cavalry units attempted to disrupt the Anglo-Saxon advance through harassment tactics and flanking manoeuvres. However, the West Saxon army employed coordinated responses that incorporated cavalry formations of their own, neutralising Viking mobility advantages while maintaining formation integrity during the advance toward the besieged town. The decisive phase of the battle occurred when the main armies engaged in direct combat across the open ground south of Rochester. The Viking forces employed sophisticated battle formations that incorporated heavy infantry, light infantry, and cavalry elements in coordinated tactical arrangements. However, the Anglo-Saxon army demonstrated comparable organisational capabilities while enjoying advantages in numbers and logistical support that enabled sustained combat operations. The engagement continued for most of a day, with both sides demonstrating remarkable tactical discipline and combat effectiveness. The Viking withdrawal from Rochester occurred during the night following the main battle, as Hastings recognised that continued siege operations would likely result in the destruction of his forces without achieving meaningful territorial gains. The retreat demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had enabled Viking forces to survive and prosper during decades of continental campaigning, as the army conducted an organised withdrawal that preserved most of its combat effectiveness while avoiding catastrophic losses. The successful retreat enabled Hastings' forces to maintain their strategic options while seeking alternative opportunities for territorial expansion. The pursuit operations that followed the Viking withdrawal from Rochester revealed both the capabilities and limitations of Alfred's military reforms. West Saxon cavalry units maintained contact with the retreating Viking forces, inflicting casualties through harassment tactics, while gathering intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. However, the Anglo-Saxon army lacked the mobility and logistical capabilities necessary for sustained pursuit operations that might have achieved decisive results against the Viking forces. The limitations of Anglo-Saxon pursuit capabilities enabled Hastine's army to reach secure positions where they could reorganise for subsequent operations. The establishment of Viking winter quarters at Benfleet represented a strategic adaptation to the changed military circumstances that Hastine's forces encountered in England. The fortified camp incorporated lessons learned from the Rochester siege, creating defensive positions that could resist assault by the improved Anglo-Saxon military forces, while providing secure bases for renewed operations during the following campaign season. The fortifications included multiple defensive lines, protected harbours for the Viking fleet, and internal facilities that could support large numbers of warriors and their families during extended occupation. The diplomatic negotiations that occurred during the winter of 892-893 AD revealed the complex political calculations that influenced both Viking and Anglo-Saxon strategic decisions. Hastin attempted to establish formal agreements with the established Scandinavian populations in the Danelaw territories, seeking military support and supply arrangements that could enable renewed offensive operations against Wessex. However, these negotiations proved more difficult than anticipated, as the settled Viking populations possessed territorial interests that did not necessarily align with the conquest ambitions of the recent arrivals. The established Norse leaders in York and East Anglia faced difficult choices between supporting their ethnic kinsmen and preserving the political arrangements that had enabled successful territorial settlement. Military support for Hastine's campaigns risked provoking West Saxon retaliation that could jeopardise the agricultural and commercial investments that formed the foundation of established Norse prosperity. The diplomatic tensions that emerged from these negotiations created divisions within the Scandinavian community that would influence military operations throughout the subsequent campaign seasons. Alfred's counter-diplomatic efforts sought to exploit these divisions while strengthening his own military position through alliance arrangements with neighbouring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The West Saxon king offered territorial concessions and commercial privileges to established Norse populations in exchange for neutrality during the conflict with Hastine's forces. These negotiations demonstrated Alfred's sophisticated understanding of the political complexities within the Scandinavian community, while providing opportunities to isolate the new Viking arrivals from potential sources of support and supply. The campaign of 893 AD witnessed renewed Viking offensive operations as Hastine's forces attempted to break through Alfred's defensive network and establish secure territorial bases that could support permanent settlement. The Viking strategy emphasised coordinated attacks against multiple burts, seeking to overwhelm Anglo-Saxon defensive capabilities through simultaneous pressure at numerous locations. The attacks incorporated sophisticated siege techniques while maintaining sufficient mobility to avoid decisive engagement with superior Anglo-Saxon forces. The Siege of Exeter represented the most ambitious Viking operation of the 893 campaign season, as Hastine's forces attempted to capture one of the most strategically important fortifications in southwestern England. The Viking army that invested Exeter numbered approximately 5,000 warriors, supported by siege equipment that included catapults, battering rams, and mobile towers constructed according to techniques developed during continental campaigns. The siege operations demonstrated the technical capabilities that Viking forces had acquired through years of warfare against sophisticated opponents. However, the defence of Exeter revealed the effectiveness of Alfred's military reforms when properly implemented and supported. The town's garrison had been reinforced to over 1,000 warriors, while the fortifications had been strengthened with additional earthworks and defensive obstacles that channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The defensive strategy incorporated coordinated responses by garrison forces and relief expeditions that maintained constant pressure on the Viking besiegers while preventing effective consolidation of their positions. The failure of the Exeter siege marked a crucial turning point in Hastine's English campaigns, as the inability to capture major fortified positions demonstrated the limitations of traditional Viking siege techniques against Alfred's improved defensive systems. The prolonged siege operations had exhausted substantial Viking resources while failing to achieve territorial gains that could justify the investment in time and manpower. The strategic failure forced reconsideration of Viking operational objectives and tactical methods that would influence subsequent military decisions. The strategic failure at Exeter and subsequent Viking withdrawals marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in the relationship between Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon authorities throughout England. Hastine's departure in 896 AD, following 4 years of unsuccessful campaigning against Alfred's reformed military system, effectively ended the era of large-scale Viking conquest attempts while accelerating the consolidation of established Norse communities within the Danelaw territories. The demographic and cultural changes that had begun during the initial settlement period now deepened into permanent alterations of English society that would persist for centuries beyond the political reunification of the kingdom. The population dynamics within the Danelaw territories by 900 AD reflected the cumulative impact of 3 decades of Scandinavian settlement and cultural integration. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites throughout Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and East Anglia indicates that Scandinavian settlers and their descendants comprised between 25 and 40% of the total population in heavily settled areas, with concentrations reaching even higher percentages in specific river valleys and coastal regions. The demographic transformation extended beyond simple numerical presence to encompass fundamental changes in social organisation, economic activity, and cultural expression that distinguished these territories from regions that remained under continuous Anglo-Saxon control. The linguistic transformation that accompanied demographic change proved particularly profound and enduring. The intensive contact between Old Norse and Old English speakers in mixed communities created conditions that facilitated rapid linguistic evolution, producing dialectical variations that incorporated fundamental elements from both language families. The adoption of Scandinavian pronouns, including they, them, and their, occurred throughout the Danelaw territories and eventually spread to other regions of England. Similarly, basic vocabulary items including husband, knife, skin, and sky entered English usage through daily interaction between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations. The linguistic changes extended beyond simple vocabulary borrowing to include alterations in grammatical structures, particularly the simplification of case endings and the adoption of Scandinavian word order patterns that would permanently influence English language development. Place name evidence provides the most comprehensive documentation of Scandinavian settlement patterns and their geographic distribution throughout northern and eastern England. The systematic analysis of settlement names reveals that over 1,500 English villages bear names of Scandinavian origin, with the highest concentrations occurring in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, and parts of East Anglia. The distribution of place names ending in by, thorpe, and thwaite corresponds closely with archaeological evidence of Scandinavian material culture, confirming the density and permanence of Norse settlement in these regions. The persistence of these place names through subsequent centuries of political change demonstrates the deep roots that Scandinavian communities established within English territorial frameworks. The legal traditions that evolved within Scandinavian territories created lasting institutional changes that influenced English jurisprudence long after the political reunification of the kingdom. The legal codes developed during the settlement period incorporated Scandinavian concepts of individual rights and compensation that differed significantly from Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, emphasizing collective responsibility and royal authority. The Scandinavian legal framework included provisions for jury trials conducted by panels of 12 free men, a practice that would eventually spread throughout England and influence the development of common law procedures. The emphasis on monetary compensation, rather than physical punishment for many crimes, reflected Scandinavian legal values that prioritised restoration over retribution, creating precedents that would influence English legal development for centuries. The administrative structures established within the Danelaw territories demonstrated remarkable institutional innovation that combined Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon governmental traditions in ways that enhanced administrative efficiency while preserving cultural autonomy. The wapentake system that replaced Anglo-Saxon hundreds in many Scandinavian areas created larger administrative units that corresponded more closely to natural geographical boundaries while facilitating the governance of mixed populations. The wapentakes typically encompassed territories that could support 1,000 to 2,000 households, providing sufficient demographic and economic resources to maintain effective local government while enabling representation of both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon interests in administrative proceedings. The economic transformations that occurred within Scandinavian territories extended far beyond agriculture to encompass fundamental changes in craft production, commercial organisation, and urban development that created new forms of wealth generation and distribution. The expansion of metalworking activities, particularly iron production and weapon manufacture, reflected both the technical expertise of Scandinavian craftsmen and the market demands created by ongoing military activities throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from production sites indicates that iron output increased substantially during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, with standardized production techniques that enabled efficient manufacture of tools, weapons, and agricultural implements for both local consumption and regional trade networks. The development of specialized textile production represented another area where Scandinavian settlement created lasting economic changes. The combination of Scandinavian weaving techniques with Anglo-Saxon wool processing methods produced high-quality fabrics that commanded premium prices in both domestic and export markets. The archaeological record reveals substantial increases in loom weights and other textile production equipment at settlement sites throughout the Danelaw territories, indicating the expansion of household-based textile manufacture that supplemented agricultural income while providing goods for commercial exchange. The textile industry that developed during this period established production capabilities that would support urban growth and commercial expansion throughout the medieval period. Urban development accelerated throughout the Danelaw territories as commercial expansion and population growth created demands for specialised services and administrative facilities that could not be provided by rural communities. The transformation of existing Anglo-Saxon towns and the establishment of new commercial centres reflected both Scandinavian urban planning concepts and the practical requirements for governing mixed populations. York's evolution into Jorvik represented the most dramatic example of urban transformation, as the city's population may have reached 15,000 inhabitants by 920 AD, making it one of the largest urban centres in contemporary Northern Europe. The commercial networks that connected Scandinavian territories with broader European markets created new opportunities for wealth accumulation, while establishing England's integration into international trading systems that extended from Greenland to Constantinople. The archaeological evidence for imported goods, including amber from the Baltic region, furs from northern Scandinavia, and silk from Byzantine territories, demonstrates the scope and sophistication of these commercial relationships. The trading connections provided access to luxury goods and strategic materials, while creating export markets for English agricultural products, textiles and manufactured goods that supported economic growth throughout the Danelaw territories. The gradual reconquest of the Danelaw territories began under Edward the Elder, who inherited both his father's military innovations and the strategic advantages created by decades of defensive preparation and political consolidation. Edward's accession to the West Saxon throne in 899 AD coincided with the completion of Alfred's Burh system and the maturation of military reforms that had transformed Anglo-Saxon fighting capabilities. The new king possessed military resources and organisational systems that surpassed anything available to previous Anglo-Saxon rulers, while the established Scandinavian populations faced internal divisions and external pressures that reduced their capacity for coordinated resistance. Edward's strategic approach to reconquest differed significantly from traditional Anglo-Saxon military methods, emphasising systematic territorial control rather than decisive battlefield victories. The West Saxon advance into Scandinavian territories proceeded through careful coordination of military pressure with diplomatic negotiations that offered favourable terms to Norse communities willing to accept Anglo-Saxon authority. This approach recognised that successful territorial integration required the cooperation of established populations rather than their destruction or displacement, creating incentives for peaceful submission while maintaining military pressure on those who continue to resist. The construction of new burhs within conquered territories provided the foundation for Edward's systematic approach to territorial consolidation. Each newly captured area received fortified positions that could maintain Anglo-Saxon control, while providing security for local populations that accepted West Saxon authority. The burh construction program incorporated lessons learned from Alfred's original defensive network, while adapting to the specific requirements of governing mixed populations that included substantial Scandinavian communities. The fortifications served dual functions as military bases and administrative centres, housing the officials and garrison forces necessary for effective territorial governance. The military campaigns that achieved Edward's territorial expansion demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Anglo-Saxon forces had achieved through decades of warfare and systematic reform. The West Saxon army that advanced into Scandinavian territories included professional standing forces equipped with standardized weapons and armour, supported by specialized units trained in siege warfare, cavalry operations, and river crossing techniques. The military organisation incorporated intelligence networks that provided detailed information about Scandinavian defensive capabilities and political divisions, enabling strategic planning that maximised advantages while minimising risks and casualties. The siege warfare capabilities that Edward's forces employed against Scandinavian fortifications represented the culmination of Anglo-Saxon military development during the Viking period. The West Saxon army included engineering units capable of constructing and operating sophisticated siege equipment, including catapults, battering rams, and mobile towers that could challenge even well-fortified positions. The engineering expertise incorporated knowledge gained from captured Viking equipment and techniques observed during previous campaigns, adapted to Anglo-Saxon tactical requirements and available materials. These capabilities enabled offensive operations that could reduce fortified positions without requiring prolonged siege operations that might exhaust Anglo-Saxon resources. The diplomatic strategies that accompanied Edward's military campaigns reflected sophisticated understanding of the political complexities within Scandinavian communities and the practical requirements for successful territorial integration. The West Saxon king offered terms that preserved local autonomy in cultural and religious matters, while requiring acknowledgement of Anglo-Saxon political authority and payment of regular tribute. These arrangements enabled Scandinavian communities to maintain their distinctive characteristics while accepting integration into the expanding West Saxon kingdom, creating precedents for multicultural governance that would influence English political development throughout the medieval period. The submission of major Scandinavian strongholds occurred through combinations of military pressure and negotiated agreements that reflected the practical limitations facing Norse communities by the early 10th century. The capture of Bedford in 915 AD demonstrated the effectiveness of Edward's systematic approach, as the town's Scandinavian garrison chose surrender rather than face destruction through prolonged siege operations. The terms of surrender preserved the lives and property of the garrison while requiring acknowledgement of West Saxon authority and integration into Edward's administrative system. Similar negotiated submissions occurred at Huntingdon, Cambridge, and other major Scandinavian centres throughout the following years. The administrative integration of conquered territories required careful balance between maintaining effective control and preserving the cultural autonomy that made peaceful submission attractive to Scandinavian communities. Edward's government developed hybrid administrative systems that incorporated both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian officials in positions of local authority, ensuring that governmental decisions reflected understanding of both cultural perspectives while maintaining consistency with royal policy objectives. The resulting administrative structures created precedents for multicultural governance that would influence English political development long after the completion of territorial reunification. Æthelstan's accession to the throne in 924 AD marked the beginning of the final phase of territorial reconquest, as the new king possessed both the military resources accumulated during Edward's campaigns and the political legitimacy necessary for claiming authority over all English territories. Æthelstan's strategic vision encompassed not merely the conquest of remaining Scandinavian territories, but the creation of a unified English kingdom that could command respect from European powers while maintaining internal stability among diverse populations. The military and diplomatic capabilities that Æthelstan inherited provided the foundation for achieving these ambitious objectives through systematic campaigns that combined overwhelming force with attractive terms for peaceful submission. The conquest of York in 927 AD represented the culmination of decades of Anglo-Saxon military development and strategic planning. The campaign that achieved this objective demonstrated the tactical sophistication and logistical capabilities that distinguished Æthelstan's forces from earlier Anglo-Saxon armies. The West Saxon advance on York proceeded through coordinated movements by multiple army divisions that prevented Scandinavian forces from concentrating effective resistance while maintaining supply lines that could sustain extended operations in hostile territory. The siege operations that followed incorporated sophisticated engineering techniques and coordinated assault methods that overwhelmed the city's defences within weeks, rather than the months typically required for such operations. The political arrangements established following York's conquest reflected Æthelstan's understanding that successful territorial integration required more than military occupation. The king's settlement with the city's Scandinavian population preserved local autonomy in commercial and cultural matters, while establishing clear frameworks for political authority and legal jurisdiction. The arrangements included provisions for maintaining York's commercial relationships with Scandinavian territories, while ensuring that these activities served English political interests, rather than undermining royal authority. The success of these arrangements demonstrated the viability of multicultural governance when supported by adequate military resources and administrative capabilities. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD marked the decisive confrontation that confirmed Æthelstan's authority over the unified English kingdom, while demonstrating the military capabilities that distinguished his forces from contemporary European armies. The battle developed when a coalition of Scottish, Irish, and remaining Scandinavian forces attempted to reverse Anglo-Saxon territorial gains through coordinated military action. The coalition army included experienced warriors from multiple kingdoms, creating one of the largest military forces assembled in 10th century Britain. However, the tactical coordination and equipment advantages that Æthelstan's forces possessed proved decisive during the engagement, resulting in overwhelming Anglo-Saxon victory that eliminated organised resistance to English reunification. The cultural synthesis that emerged from decades of Scandinavian settlement and subsequent Anglo-Saxon reconquest created distinctive regional characteristics that persisted throughout the medieval period. The populations of northern and eastern England retained linguistic, legal and cultural elements that reflected their Scandinavian heritage while accepting integration into the unified English kingdom. These regional variations included distinctive architectural styles, agricultural techniques, and social customs that demonstrated the lasting impact of cultural contact between Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon populations. The synthesis created cultural diversity within the unified kingdom that enriched English civilization while maintaining sufficient political unity to support effective governmental administration. The persistence of Scandinavian influence in English legal traditions extended far beyond the territories of original Norse settlement to influence the development of common law throughout the kingdom. The jury system that originated in Scandinavian legal traditions spread gradually to other regions of England, creating standardized legal procedures that enhanced the fairness and efficiency of judicial proceedings. The emphasis on monetary compensation rather than physical punishment for many crimes reflected Scandinavian legal values that proved attractive to Anglo-Saxon populations, leading to broader adoption of these principles throughout the English legal system. The final expulsion of Eric Bludax from York in 954 AD marked the end of independent Viking rule in England, while demonstrating the complete transformation of political relationships that had occurred since the original Great Heathen army landed nearly a century earlier. Eric's brief reign as King of York represented the last attempt to establish autonomous Scandinavian political authority within England, drawing support from Norwegian allies and remaining Norse populations who opposed integration into the English kingdom. However, the military and political resources available to Eric proved inadequate against the consolidated English forces that King Eadred could deploy, resulting in decisive defeat that eliminated the final vestiges of independent Viking political authority. The circumstances surrounding Eric's expulsion revealed both the strengths and limitations of Scandinavian political organisation in 10th century England. Eric's support base included Norwegian merchants and warriors who maintained commercial and kinship connections with Scandinavian homelands, providing access to external resources and military assistance that enabled temporary resistance to English authority. However, the established Norse populations within York and surrounding territories possessed economic interests that depended on peaceful relationships with English authorities, creating internal divisions that undermined effective resistance to Eadred's forces. The failure to achieve unified Scandinavian support demonstrated the extent to which decades of settlement and cultural integration had altered the political loyalties of Norse communities within England. The military campaign that achieved Eric's defeat incorporated tactical innovations and logistical capabilities that reflected the cumulative development of English military organisation since Alfred's original reforms. Eadred's forces employed coordinated siege operations that isolated York from external support while maintaining pressure that prevented effective defensive preparations. The campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic military planning combined with adequate resources and experienced leadership, achieving decisive results within months rather than the years typically required for such operations during earlier periods. The systematic expulsion of Eric Bludax from York in 954 AD marked the end of independent Viking political authority in England. Yet the material and cultural transformations initiated by the Great Heathen army continued to shape English civilization for centuries beyond the restoration of unified Anglo-Saxon rule. The archaeological record reveals the profound and lasting impact of Scandinavian settlement on English society, demonstrating that the Viking invasions represented far more than temporary military disruption. Instead, they constituted a fundamental demographic and cultural transformation that permanently altered the character of medieval England through the introduction of new technologies, social structures, and cultural practices that became integral elements of English civilization. Archaeological excavations conducted throughout the former Danelaw territories have revealed extensive evidence of Scandinavian material culture that demonstrates both the scale of Norse settlement and the sophisticated level of cultural integration achieved between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations. Excavations at Coppergate in York have uncovered substantial evidence of Scandinavian craftsmanship, including leatherworking tools, amber jewellery, and iron weapons that display distinctively Norse decorative motifs, alongside Anglo-Saxon design elements. The material evidence indicates that Scandinavian craftsmen maintained their traditional techniques while adapting to local materials and market demands, creating hybrid artistic traditions that combine the best elements of both cultural backgrounds. The distribution of Scandinavian-style artefacts across northern and eastern England provides detailed documentation of settlement patterns that extended far beyond the major urban centres to encompass rural farming communities throughout Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia. Archaeological surveys have identified over 400 sites containing Scandinavian material culture, including farmsteads, workshops, and burial grounds that demonstrate the comprehensive nature of Norse territorial occupation. The artefact assemblages from these sites reveal sophisticated agricultural and craft production capabilities that enabled Scandinavian communities to achieve economic prosperity while maintaining their distinctive cultural characteristics. Burial practices documented through cemetery excavations provide particularly revealing insights into the cultural synthesis that occurred between Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon populations. The cemetery at Heath Wood in Derbyshire contains over 60 cremation burials that follow traditional Scandinavian funeral customs, including the deposition of weapons, jewellery, and personal items that would accompany the deceased into the afterlife. However, many of these burials also incorporate Anglo-Saxon elements such as Christian symbols and burial orientations that reflect the gradual adoption of local religious practices. The combination of traditional Norse and adopted Christian elements in burial practices demonstrates the complex cultural negotiations that occurred as Scandinavian communities adapted to their new territorial circumstances. The technological innovations introduced by Scandinavian settlers had lasting impacts on English agricultural and craft production that extended far beyond the immediate settlement areas. Archaeological evidence from blacksmithing sites throughout the Danelaw territories reveals the introduction of advanced iron-working techniques that enabled more efficient production of tools, weapons, and agricultural implements. The Scandinavian expertise in iron production included knowledge of specialised furnace designs and quenching techniques that produced higher quality metal products than traditional Anglo-Saxon methods. These technological improvements increased agricultural productivity while creating competitive advantages for English craft production that would influence economic development throughout the medieval period. The urban archaeology of York provides the most comprehensive documentation of Scandinavian impact on English urban development and commercial organisation. Excavations in the Coppergate area have revealed extensive evidence of specialised craft production, including leatherworking, metalworking, and textile manufacture, that demonstrates the sophisticated economic organisation achieved by the Norse community in Jorvik. The archaeological evidence indicates that the city's population during the 10th century included craftsmen specialising in amberworking, bone carving, and jewellery manufacture, who produced goods for both local consumption and long-distance trade networks extending throughout northern Europe. The commercial networks documented through archaeological evidence demonstrate the extent to which Scandinavian settlement connected England with broader European trading systems that brought new goods and technologies into English territories. Excavations at Scandinavian trading sites have yielded evidence of imported materials including amber from the Baltic region, walrus ivory from the Arctic, silk from Byzantine territories, and silver from Islamic lands that demonstrate the scope and sophistication of Norse commercial relationships. These trading connections provided access to luxury goods and strategic materials, while creating export markets for English products that supported economic growth throughout the former Danelaw territories. The linguistic legacy of Scandinavian settlement represents perhaps the most enduring and pervasive impact of the Great Heathen Army's conquest campaigns. The systematic analysis of Middle English texts reveals that over 2,000 words of Scandinavian origin entered the English language during the settlement period and remained in common usage throughout the medieval period and beyond. These linguistic borrowings encompassed fundamental vocabulary, including basic verbs such as take, give, and get, along with essential nouns like husband, knife, window, and egg that became integral elements of English expression. The adoption of such basic vocabulary items indicates the intensive daily contact between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations that created conditions for rapid linguistic change. The grammatical changes that occurred in English during the Scandinavian settlement period demonstrate even more profound linguistic influence than simple vocabulary borrowing. The adoption of Scandinavian pronoun forms including they, them, and their replaced traditional Anglo-Saxon equivalents throughout northern and eastern England before spreading to other regions of the kingdom. Similarly, the simplification of case endings and the adoption of Scandinavian word order patterns fundamentally altered English grammatical structures in ways that distinguished Middle English from its Anglo-Saxon predecessor. These grammatical changes reflect the intensive bilingual communication that occurred in mixed communities where both languages were used for daily interaction. The placename evidence provides comprehensive documentation of Scandinavian settlement density and geographical distribution throughout the areas of Norse territorial control. The systematic analysis of English placenames has identified over 1,500 settlements bearing names of Scandinavian origin, with the highest concentrations occurring in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, and parts of East Anglia. The distribution of place names ending in distinctively Scandinavian elements such as by, Thorpe, Thwaite, and Toft corresponds closely with archaeological evidence of Norse material culture, confirming both the density and permanence of Scandinavian settlement in these regions. The survival of Scandinavian place names through subsequent centuries of political change demonstrates the deep roots that Norse communities established within English territorial frameworks. Many of these place names retain their original Scandinavian forms despite centuries of Anglo-Saxon and later Norman political control, indicating that local populations continue to use Norse terminology for geographical features and settlement names long after the end of independent Viking political authority. The persistence of Scandinavian toponymy reflects the demographic significance of Norse settlement and the cultural continuity that connected medieval English communities with their Scandinavian heritage. The legal innovations introduced by Scandinavian settlers created lasting institutional changes that influenced English jurisprudence throughout the medieval period and beyond. The legal codes developed within the Danelaw territories incorporated Scandinavian concepts of individual rights and compensation that differed significantly from Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, emphasizing collective responsibility and royal authority. The Scandinavian legal framework included provisions for trial by jury conducted by panels of 12 free men, a practice that became standard throughout England and eventually influenced the development of common law procedures that remained fundamental to English legal tradition. The emphasis on monetary compensation rather than physical punishment for many crimes reflected Scandinavian legal values that prioritized restoration over retribution, creating precedents that would influence English legal development for centuries. The Wurgel system that evolved within Scandinavian territories incorporated more sophisticated calculations of individual worth and social status than traditional Anglo-Saxon legal codes, establishing precedents for legal equality and individual rights that would eventually spread throughout the English legal system. These legal innovations demonstrated the practical advantages of Scandinavian judicial procedures while establishing institutional frameworks that enhance the fairness and efficiency of legal proceedings. The constitutional innovations that emerged from Scandinavian settlement included administrative structures that balanced central authority with local autonomy in ways that enhanced governmental effectiveness while preserving cultural diversity. The wapentake system that replaced Anglo-Saxon hundreds in many Scandinavian areas created larger administrative units that corresponded more closely to natural geographical boundaries while facilitating the governance of mixed populations. The wapentakes typically encompassed territories that could support substantial populations while enabling representation of both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon interests in administrative proceedings. The governmental structures that evolved within the Danelaw territories demonstrated remarkable institutional innovation that combined Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon administrative traditions in ways that enhanced efficiency while preserving cultural autonomy. The hybrid administrative systems that emerged incorporated both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon officials in positions of local authority, ensuring that governmental decisions reflected understanding of both cultural perspectives while maintaining consistency with broader policy objectives. These administrative innovations established precedents for multicultural governance that would influence English political development throughout the medieval period. The historiographical debates surrounding the Great Heathen Army have evolved considerably as archaeological evidence and linguistic analysis have provided new insights into the scale and impact of Scandinavian settlement in England. Early historical interpretations, heavily influenced by Anglo-Saxon chronicle accounts that emphasise the destructive aspects of Viking raids, portrayed the Great Heathen Army primarily as a military force that disrupted existing social and political structures without creating lasting positive contributions to English civilization. These interpretations reflected both the limited archaeological evidence available to earlier scholars and the cultural biases that portrayed Viking activities as fundamentally barbaric and destructive. Modern archaeological research has fundamentally revised understanding of Scandinavian impact on English development by revealing extensive evidence of peaceful settlement, cultural integration, and technological innovation that demonstrates the constructive aspects of Norse territorial occupation. The material evidence indicates that Scandinavian settlers contributed significantly to English economic development through the introduction of advanced agricultural techniques, sophisticated craft production methods, and extensive commercial networks that connected England with broader European trading systems. These contributions created lasting benefits that enhanced English prosperity while establishing cultural foundations that would influence English civilization throughout the medieval period. The demographic analysis of Scandinavian settlement has become a major focus of scholarly debate as historians attempt to determine the actual scale of Norse territorial occupation and its impact on existing Anglo-Saxon populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Scandinavian settlers comprised substantial minorities in heavily settled areas, with concentrations reaching 25 to 40% of total population in specific regions. However, the interpretation of this evidence remains contested, with some scholars arguing for even higher concentrations of Scandinavian settlement, while others maintain that Norse demographic impact was more limited than the archaeological record suggests. The cultural impact debate encompasses questions about the extent to which Scandinavian settlement fundamentally altered English society versus simply adding new elements to existing Anglo-Saxon cultural frameworks. The linguistic evidence demonstrates extensive Scandinavian influence on English language development, while archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated cultural synthesis that incorporated elements from both traditions. However, scholars continue to debate whether these changes constituted fundamental transformation of English civilization or represented adaptation and enhancement of existing cultural patterns through contact with Scandinavian traditions. The economic impact of Scandinavian settlement has generated scholarly discussion about the extent to which Norse territorial occupation enhanced or disrupted existing Anglo-Saxon economic systems. Archaeological evidence indicates that Scandinavian settlers introduced technological innovations and commercial networks that increased overall productivity while creating new forms of wealth generation and distribution. However, the assessment of these economic changes remains complicated by limited evidence about pre-settlement economic conditions and the difficulty of distinguishing between changes caused by Scandinavian settlement versus broader European economic trends during the 9th and 10th centuries. The political legacy of the Great Heathen Army encompasses both immediate constitutional changes and long-term institutional developments that influenced English governmental evolution throughout the medieval period. The administrative innovations developed within the Danelaw territories established precedents for local autonomy and cultural diversity that would influence English political development long after the restoration of unified Anglo-Saxon rule. The legal traditions that emerged from Scandinavian settlement contributed fundamental elements to English jurisprudence that remain influential in modern legal systems. The military innovations introduced by the Great Heathen Army fundamentally transformed Anglo-Saxon defensive strategies and tactical doctrines in ways that enhanced English military capabilities throughout the medieval period. The siege warfare techniques, cavalry tactics, and coordinated infantry formations that Viking forces employed against Anglo-Saxon kingdoms forced corresponding innovations in English military organisation that created more effective defensive systems. The military reforms implemented by Alfred and his successors incorporated lessons learned from Viking tactical methods, while adapting these techniques to Anglo-Saxon strategic requirements and available resources. The cultural synthesis that emerged from decades of Scandinavian settlement and subsequent Anglo-Saxon reconquest created distinctive regional characteristics that persisted throughout the medieval period and beyond. The populations of northern and eastern England retained linguistic, legal, and cultural elements that reflected their Scandinavian heritage while accepting integration into the unified English kingdom. These regional variations contributed to the cultural diversity that enriched English civilization, while maintaining sufficient political unity to support effective governmental administration. The international significance of the Great Heathen Army's campaigns extended beyond their immediate impact on English political development to influence broader European historical patterns during the 9th and 10th centuries. The success of Scandinavian territorial conquest in England demonstrated the military capabilities and organisational sophistication that Viking forces had achieved, encouraging similar expansion efforts throughout northern Europe. The establishment of the Danelaw territories created precedents for Scandinavian settlement that would influence subsequent Viking activities in Ireland, Scotland, and continental European territories. The historical assessment of the Great Heathen Army's legacy must acknowledge both the destructive aspects of their initial conquest campaigns and the constructive contributions that emerged from subsequent settlement and cultural integration. The military campaigns that established Scandinavian control over northern and eastern England caused substantial disruption to existing social and political structures, while inflicting significant casualties on Anglo-Saxon populations. However, the peaceful settlement that followed these conquests created lasting benefits through technological innovation, commercial development, and cultural synthesis that enhanced English civilization. The enduring impact of the Great Heathen Army on English historical development demonstrates the complex and multifaceted nature of cultural contact between different ethnic groups during the medieval period. The Scandinavian settlement of England resulted in fundamental changes to language, law, and social organisation that persisted long after the end of independent Viking political authority. These changes created cultural foundations that would influence English development throughout the medieval period, while establishing precedents for multicultural society that remain relevant to modern historical understanding. The great heathen army's transformation from a conquering military force into settled communities that contributed to English prosperity demonstrates the adaptive capabilities of both Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon populations. The successful integration of Norse communities into English society created cultural diversity that enriched civilization while maintaining political unity that enabled effective governance. This achievement represents one of the most successful examples of cultural integration in medieval European history, establishing patterns that would influence subsequent historical development throughout the continent. The legacy of the great heathen army thus encompasses far more than their immediate military conquests, extending to fundamental transformations of English society that created lasting benefits for subsequent generations. Their impact on language, law, technology and culture established foundations that would support English development throughout the medieval period, while creating precedents for successful multicultural integration that remain historically significant. The enduring influence of their settlement demonstrates that the true measure of historical significance lies not merely in military achievement but in the lasting contributions that emerge from cultural contact and adaptation between different peoples.